but his eyes have that peculiar sagging of the skin, above the lids which often comes with increasing age, and the fall of his firm lips. Of the corners bestowed upon him an air of defiant determination. He engaged in a hushed conversation with Montgomery. In a tone too low for me to hear, from him my eyes traveled to his three men. An unusual group they were. I saw only their visages. Yet there was something in their visages, I knew not what. That gave me an inexplicable wave of revulsion. I looked steadily at them, and the impression did not pass. Though I failed to see what an occasion did, they seemed to me then to be tanned individuals. But their limbs were oddly swayed in some thin, soiled white garments down even to the fingers and feet. I've never encountered men so heavily draped and women so. Only in the East, they wore head wraps too, and thereunder peered out their elfin visages at me, visages with prominent mandibles and luminous gaze. They had straight, coarse black locks resembling the coarse strands of a horse's mane. It seemed as they sat to remarkable height. Any race of men I've seen, the white-head man, who I knew was a good 6 feet in height, sat a head below any one of the three. I found afterwards that really, none were taller than myself. But their bodies were abnormally long and the thigh, part of the leg short and curiously twisted. But anyway, they were an amazingly ugly gang, and over the heads of them, under the forward log peered the black face of the man, whose eyes were luminous in the dark. As I stared at them, they met my gaze. And then first one, and then another, turned away from my direct stare, and looked at me in an odd 30th manner. It occurred to me that I was perhaps annoying them, and I turned my attention to the island we were approaching. It was low and covered with thick vegetation, chiefly a kind of palm that was new to me. From one point a thin, white thread of vapor rose, startlingly to an immense height, and then frayed out like a down feather. We were now within the embrace of a broad bay, flanked on either hand by low promontory. The beach was of dull gray sand, and sloped steeply up to a ridge, perhaps 60 or 70 feet above the sea level, and irregularly set, with trees and undergrowth. Halfway up was a square enclosure of some gray stone, which the first found subsequently was built partly of coral and partly of pumiceous lava. Two thatched roofs peeped from within this enclosure. A man stood awaiting us at the water's edge. I fancied while we were still far off that I saw some other, and very grotesque-looking creatures scuttle into the bushes upon the slope. But I saw nothing of these as we drew nearer. This man was a moderate size, and with a black negroid face. He had a large, almost lipless mouth, extraordinary lank arms, long thin feet, and bow legs, and stood with his heavy face thrust forward. Staring at us, he was dressed like Montgomery, and his white-haired companion, in jacket and trousers of blue serge. As we came still nearer, this individual began to run to and throw on the beach, making the most grotesque movement at a word of command from Montgomery. The 4 men in the launch sprang up, and with singularly awkward gestures struck the logs. Montgomery steered us round and into a narrow little dock excavated in the beach. Then the man on the beach hastened towards us. This dock, as I call it, was really a mere ditch, just long enough at this phase of the tide to take the longboat. I heard the bowels ground in the sand, stave the dinghy off the rudder of the big boat with my pig in, and freeing the painter landed. The 3 muffled men, with the clumsiest movements, scrambled out upon the sand and forth, with set to landing the cargo. Assisted by the man on the beach, I was struck especially by the curious movements of the legs of the 3 swaves and bandaged boatmen. Not stiff they were, but distorted in some old way, almost as if they were jointed in the wrong place. The dogs were still snarling and strained at their chains after these men as the white-head man landed with them. The 3 big fellows spoke to one another in odd, guttural tones, and the man who had waited for us on the beach began chattering to them excitedly, a foreign language as I fancied, as they laid hands on some bales piled near the stern. Somewhere I had heard such a voice before, and I could not think where. The white-head man stood, holding in a tumult of 6 dogs and bawling orders over their din. Montgomery, having unshipped the rudder, landed likewise, and all set to work at unloading. I was to faint, but with my long fast, and the sun beating down on my bare head, to offer any assistance. Presently, the white-haired man seemed to recollect my presence, and came up to me. "You look Teddy, as though you were scarcely breakfasted." His little eyes were brilliant black. Under his heavy brows, I must apologize for that. "Now, you are a guest, we must make you comfortable. Though you are uninvited, you know." He looked keenly into my face. "Montgomery says you are an educated man. Mr. Prinnock says you know something of science. May I ask what that signifies?" I told him. I had spent some years at the Royal College of Science, and had done some researches in biology under Huxley. He raised his eyebrows slightly at that. "That alters the case, little Miss Prinnock," he said with a trifle more respect. "In this manner as it happens, we are biologists here. This is a biological station of sort." His eye rested on the men in white, who were busily hauling the Puma on rollers towards the wall yard iron. "Montgomery, at least he had it. Then when you will be able to get away? I can't say we're off the track to anywhere. We see a ship once in a 12-month or so." He left me abruptly and went up the beach, past this group, and I think entered the enclosure. The other 2 men were with Montgomery, erecting a pile of smaller packages on a low wheel truck. The llama was still on the launch, with the rabbit hutches. The staghounds were still lashed to the thwarts. The pile of things completed, all 3 men laid hold of the truck and began shoving the ton weight or so upon it. After the Puma, presently Montgomery left them, and coming back to me, held out his hand. "I'm glad," said he. "For my own part, that captain was a silly ass. He'd made things lively for you. It was you today that saved me again." "That depends. You'll find this island an infernally rum place. I promise you I watch my going carefully. If I were you." He hesitated, and seemed to alter his mind about what was on his lips. "I wish you'd help me with these rabbits," he said. His procedure with the rabbits was singular. I weighted him with him and helped him lug one of the hutches ashore. No sooner was that done than he opened the door of it, and tilting the thing on one end, turned its living contents out on the ground. They fell in a struggling heap, one on the top of the other. He clapped his hands and forthwith went off with that hopping run of theirs. 15 or 20 of them, I should think. Up the beach increasing. "Multiply," my friend said. Montgomery replenished the island, either to a better certain lack of meat here, as I watched them disappearing. The white-haired man returned with a brandy flask and some biscuits, "Something to go on with Prinnock," said he in a far more familiar tone than before. I made no ado but set to work on the biscuits at once, while the white-haired man helped Montgomery to release about a score more of the rabbits. 3 big hutches, however, went up to the house with a Puma. The brandy I did not touch, for I've been an abstainer from my birth. Chapter 7: The Locked Door. The reader will perhaps understand that at first, everything was so strange about me, and my position was the outcome of such unexpected adventures, that I had no discernment of the relative strangeness of this or that thing. I followed the llama up the beach, was overtaken by Montgomery, who asked me not to enter the stone enclosure. I noticed then that the Puma in its cage and the pilot packages have been placed outside the entrance to this quadrangle. I turned and saw that the launch had now been unloaded, run out again, was being beached. The white-haired man was walking towards us. He addressed Montgomery. "And now comes the problem of this uninvited guest. What we to do with him? He knows something of science," said Montgomery. "I'm itching to get to work again with this new stuff," said the white-haired man, nodding towards the enclosure. His eyes grew brighter. "I dare say you are," said Montgomery in anything but a cordial tone. "We can't send him over there. and we can't spare the time to build him a new shanty, and we certainly can't take him into our confidence. Just yet I'm in your hands, said I had no idea what he meant by over there. I've been thinking of the same things. Montgomery answered this. My room with the outdoor, that's it. So the older man promptly. Looking at Montgomery, and all three of us went towards enclosure. I'm sorry to make a mystery, Mr. Frindick, but you'll remember you're uninvited. Our little establishment here contains a secret, or so is a kind of Bluebeard chamber. In fact, nothing very dreadful really to a sane man. But just now, as we don't know, you decidedly said I should be a fool. To take offense at any want of confidence, he twisted his firm lips into a faint smile. He was one of those sat-like people who smile with the corners of the mouth down, and bowed his acknowledgement of my complacence. The main entrance to the enclosure was passed. It was a heavy wooden gate, framed in iron and locked, with the cargo of the launch piled outside it, and at the corner, we came to a small doorway I'd not previously observed. The white-haired man produced a bundle of keys. From the pocket of his greasy blue jacket opened this door and entered, his keys and the elaborate locking up of the place, even while it was still under his eye, struck me as peculiar. I followed him and found myself in a small apartment, plainly but not uncomfortably furnished, and with its inner door, which was slightly ajar opening into a paved courtyard. This inner door Montgomery once closed, a hammock was slung across the darker corner of the room, and a small unglazed window defended by an iron bar looked out towards the sea. This, the white-haired man told me, was to be my apartment and the inner door, which for fear of accidents, he said he would lock on the other side. Was my limit inward? He called my attention to a convenient deck chair before the window, and to an array of old books. Chiefly I found surgical works, and editions of the Latin and Greek classics, languages I cannot read with any comfort, on a shelf near the hammock. He left the room by the outer door, as if to avoid opening the inner one again. We usually have our meals in here, to Montgomery, and then, as if in doubt, went out after the other bro. I heard him call, and for the moment, I do not think I noticed. Then as I handled the books on the shelf, it came up in consciousness. Where had I heard the name of Moreau before? I sat down before the window, took out the biscuits that still remained to me, and ate them with an excellent appetite. Moreau, through the window, I saw one of those unaccountable men in white, lugging a packing case along the beach. Presently the window frame hit him. Then I heard a key inserted, and turned and locked behind me. After a little while I heard through the locked door the noise of the staghounds that are now been brought up from the beach. They were not barking, but sniffing and growling in a curious fashion. I could hear the rapid patter of their feet, and Montgomery's voice soothing them. I was very much impressed by the elaborate secrecy of these two men regarding the contents of the place, and for some time I was thinking of that, and of the unaccountable familiarity of the name of Moreau. But so odd is the human memory that I could not then recall that well-known name in its proper connection. From that my thoughts went to the indefinable queerness of the deformed man. On the beach I never saw such a gait, such odd motions as he pulled at the box. I recall that none of these men had spoken to me, though most of them I had found looking at me at one time or another in a peculiarly footed manner, quite unlike the frank stare of your unsophisticated savage. Indeed, they had all seemed remarkably taciturn. When they did speak, endowed with very uncanny voices. What was wrong with them? Then I recall the eyes of Montgomery's ungainly attendant. Just as I was thinking of him, he came in. He was now dressed in white and carried a little tray with some coffee and boiled vegetables thereon. I could hardly repress a shuddering recoil as he came, bending amiably, and placed the tray before me on the table. Then astonishment paralyzed me under his stringy black locks. I saw his ear. He jumped upon me suddenly, close to my face, The man had pointed ears covered with a fine brown fur. "Your breakfast, sir," he said. I stared at his face without attempting to answer him. He turned and went towards the door, regarding me oddly over his shoulder. I followed him out with my eyes, and as I did so, by some odd trick of unconscious celebration that came surging into my head, the phrase "the Morau Hollows" was at the Morau. It sent my memory back 10 years. The Morau Horrors. The phrase drifted loose in my mind for a moment, and then I saw it in red lettering on a little buff, colored pamphlet to read, which made one shiver and creep. Then I remembered distinctly all about it. That long-forgotten pamphlet came back with startling vividness to my mind. I had been a mere lad then. A Morau was, I suppose, about 50, a prominent and masterful physiologist, well known in scientific circles, but his extraordinary imagination and his brutal directness in discussion, what is the same row? He had published some various, astonishing fact in connection with the transfusion of blood, and in addition, was known to be doing valuable work on morbid growth. Then suddenly his career was closed. He had to leave England. The journalist obtained access to his laboratory in the capacity of laboratory assistant, with the deliberate intention of making sensational exposures. By the help of a shocking accident, if it was an accident, his gruesome pamphlet became notorious on the day of its publication. A wretched dog, flayed and otherwise mutilated, escaped from a rose house. It was in the silly season, and a prominent editor, a cousin of the temporary laboratory assistant, appealed to the conscience of the nation. It was not the first time that conscience has turned against the methods of research. The doctor was simply howled out of the country. It may be that he deserved to be, but I still think that the tepid support of his fellow investigators and his desertion by the great body of scientific workers was a shameful thing. Yet some of his experiments, by the journalist's account, were wantonly cruel. He might perhaps have purchased his social peace by abandoning his investigations, but he apparently preferred the latter, as most men would who have once fallen under the overmastering spell of research. He was unmarried and had, indeed, nothing but his own interest to consider. I felt convinced that this must be the same man. Everything pointed to it. It dawned upon me to what end the puma and the other animals, which had now been brought with other luggage and the enclosure behind the house, were destined, and a curious faint odor, the halidus of something familiar, an odor that had been in the background of my consciousness, hid the two, suddenly came forward into the forefront of my thoughts. It was the antiseptic odor of the dissecting room. I heard the puma growling through the wall, and one of the dogs yelped as though it had been struck. Yet surely, and especially to another scientific man, there was nothing so horrible in vivisection as to account for this secrecy, and by some odd leap in my thoughts, the pointed ears and luminous eyes of Montgomery's attendant came back again before me with the sharpest definition. I stared before me out of the green sea, frothing under a freshening breeze, and these and other strange memories of the last few days chased one another through my mind. What could it all mean? A locked enclosure on a lonely island, a notorious vivisector, and these crippled and distorted men. Chapter 8. The crying of the puma. Montgomery interrupted my tangle of mystification and suspicion. About 1 o'clock, and his grotesque attendant followed him with a tray bearing bread, some herbs and other eatables, a flask of whiskey, a jug of water, and 3 glasses and knives. I glanced askance at this strange creature and found him watching me with his queer, restless eyes. Montgomery said he would lunch with me, but the Morau was too preoccupied with some work to come. Moreau said I know that name to death. You just said he wouldn't ask how I was to mention it to you. I might have thought. Anyhow, it will give you an inkling of our mysteries. Whiskey, but no thanks. I'm an abstainer. I wish I'd been. But it's news locking the door after Steve's stolen. It was that infernal stuff which led to, by coming here that in a foggy night. I thought myself in luck at the time, when Morale offered to get me. Off, it's queer, Montgomery said. I suddenly, as the outer door closed. Why has your man pointed ears? Damn, he said over his first mouthful of food. He stared at me for a moment, and then repeated, point to the edge. Little points to them, said I as calmly as possible. With a catch in my breath, and a fine black fur at the edges. He helped himself to whisk in water. With great deliberation, I was under the impression that his hair covered his ears. I saw them as he stooped by me to put that coffee you sent to me on the table, and his eyes shine in the dark. By this time Montgomery had recovered from the surprise of my question. I always thought he said deliberately, with a certain accentuation of his flavoring of lisp, that there was something the matter with his ears, from the way covered them. What were they like? I was persuaded from his manner that this ignorance was a pretense. Still, I could hardly tell the man that I thought him a liar. Pointed, I said, rather small and furry, distinctly furry. But the whole man is one of the strangest beings I ever set eyes on, a sharp horse. Cry of animal pain came from the enclosure behind us. Its depth and volume testified to the puma. I saw Montgomery whines. Yes. He said, where did you pick up the creature? San Francisco. He's an ugly Bruce. I admit, half wicked, you know, can't remember where he came from, but I'm used to him, you know. We both are. How does this strike you? He's unnatural, I said. There's something about him. Don't think me fanciful, but it gives me a nasty little sensation, attacking in my muscles when he comes near me. It's a touch of the diabolical. In fact, Montgomery had stopped eating while I told him this rum. He said, I can't see it. He resumed his meal. I had no idea of it, he said, and masticated. The crew of the scooter must have felt it the same. Made a dead set of the port devil. Are you sure, the captain? Suddenly the puma howled again, this time more painfully. Montgomery swore under his breath. I'd have a mind to attack him. About the men on the beach. Then, the poor brute within gave vent to a series of short, sharp cries. Your men on the beach, said I. What race are they? Excellent fellows, aren't they? Said he, absent-mindedly knitting his brows. Of the animal yelled out sharply. I said no more. There was another outcry worse than the former. He looked at me with his dull gray eyes, and then took some more whiskey. He tried to draw me into a discussion about alcohol, professing to have saved my life with it. He seemed anxious to lay stress on the fact that I owed my life to him. I answered him distractedly. Presently our meal came to an end. The misshapen monster with the pointed ears cleared the remains away. Montgomery left me alone in the room again. All the time, he had been in a state of ill-concealed irritation. Had the noise of the vivisected puma. He had spoken of his old want of nerve and left me to the obvious application. I found myself that the cries were singularly irritating, and they grew in depth and intensity. As the afternoon wore on, they were painful at first, but their constant resurgence at last altogether upset my balance. I flung aside a crib of horrors I've been reading, and began to clench my fists, to bite my lips, and to pace the room. Presently I got to stopping my ears with my fingers. The emotional appeal of those yells grew upon me, steadily grew, at last to such an exquisite expression of suffering that I could stand it in that confined room no longer. I stepped out of the door, into the slumberous heat of the late afternoon, and walking past the main entrance, locked again, I noticed, turned the corner of the wall. The crying sounded even louder out of doors. It was as if all the pain in the world found a voice. Yet had I known such pain was in the next room, and had it been done, I believe I have thought since, I could have stood it well enough. It is when suffering finds a voice, and sets our nerves quivering, that this pity comes troubling us. But in spite of the brilliant sunlight, and the green fans of the trees, waving in the soothing sea breeze, the world was a confusion, blurred with drifting black and red phantasms, until I was out of earshot of the house. In the checkered wall, Chapter 9, The Thing in the Forest. I strode through the undergrowth that clothed the ridge. Behind the house, scarcely heeding whither I went, passed on, through the shadow of a thick cluster of straight, stem trees beyond it, and so presently found myself somewhere on the other side of the ridge, and descending towards a stringlet that ran through a narrow valley. I paused and listened. The distance I had come, all the intervening masses of thicket, deadened any sound that might be coming from the enclosure. The air was still, then with a rustle a rabbit emerged. When scampering up the slope before me, I hesitated and sat. Down in the edge of the shade, place was a pleasant one. The rivulet was hidden by the luxuriant vegetation of the banks, save at one point, where I caught a triangular patch of its glittering water. On the farther side I saw through a bluish haze a tangle of trees and creepers, and above these again the luminous blue of the sky. Here and there a splash of white or crimson mark, the blooming of some trailing epiphyter. I let my eyes wander over the scene for a while, and then began to turn over my mind again. The strange peculiarities Montgomery's man, but it was too hot to think elaborately, and presently I fell into a tranquil state, midway between dozing and waking. From this I was aroused after I know not how long, by rustling amidst the greenery on the other side of the stream. For a moment I could see nothing but the waving summits of the ferns and reeds. Then suddenly, upon the bank of the stream appeared something. At first I could not distinguish what it was. It bowed its round head to the water, then began to drink. Then I saw it was a man going on all fours like a beast. He was clothed in bluish cloth, and was of a copper-colored hue, with black hair. It seemed that grotesque ugliness was an invariable character of these islanders. I could hear the suck of the water at his lips as he drank. I leant forward to see him better, and a piece of lava, detached by my hand, went pattering down the slope. He looked up guiltily, and his eyes met mine. Forthwith he scrambled to his feet and stood, wiping his clumsy hand across his mouth and regarding me. His legs were scarcely half the length of his body. So staring one another out of confidence, we remained for perhaps the space of a minute. Then stopping to look back once or twice, he slunk off among the bush to the right of me, and I heard the swish of the fronds grow faint in the distance and die away long after he had disappeared. I remained sitting up, staring in the direction of his retreat. My drowsy tranquility had gone. I was startled by a noise behind me, and turning, suddenly saw the flapping white tail of a rabbit. Vanishing up the slope, I jumped my feet. The apparition of this grotesque, half-bestial creature had suddenly populated the stillness of the afternoon. For me, I looked around me rather nervously, and regretted that I was unarmed. Then I thought that the man I had just seen had been clothed in bluish cloth, had not been naked as a savage would have been, and I tried to persuade myself from that fact that he was, after all, probably a peaceful character, that the dull ferocity of his countenance belied him. Yet I was greatly disturbed at the apparition. I walked to the left along the slope, turning my head about and peering this way and that among the straight stems of the trees. Why should a man go on all fours and drink with his lips? Presently I heard an animal wailing again, and taking it to be the puma, I turned about and walked in a direction diametrically opposite to the sound. This led me down to the stream, across which I stepped, and pushed my way up through the underground. I was startled by a great patch of vivid scarlet on the ground, and going up to it, found it to be a peculiar fungus, branched and corrugated like a foliaceous lichen, but deliquescing into slime at the touch. And then in the shadow of some luxuriant ferns, I came upon an unpleasant thing. The dead body of a rabbit covered with shining flies, but still warm and with the head torn off. I stopped aghast at the sight of the scattered blood, here at least was. One visitor to the island disposed of, there were no traces about the violence about it. It looked as though it had been suddenly snatched up and killed. And as I stared at the little furry body, came the difficulty of how the thing had been done. The vague dread that had been in my mind since I had seen the inhuman face of the man. As the stream grew distincter as I stood there, I began to realize the hardihood of my expedition. Among these unknown people, the thicket about me became altered to my imagination. Every shadow became something more than a shadow, became an ambush. Every rustle became a threat. Invisible things seemed watching me. I resolved to go back to the enclosure on the beach. I suddenly turned away and thrust myself violently, possibly even frantically, through the bushes. Anxious to get a clear space about me again, I stopped just in time to prevent myself emerging upon an open space. It was a kind of glade in the forest made by a fall. Seedlings were already starting up to struggle for the vacant space, and beyond the dense growth of stems and twining vines, and splashes of fungus and flowers closed in again before me. Squatting together upon the fungoid ruins of a huge, fallen tree and still unaware of my approach, were three grotesque human figures. One was evidently a female, the other two were men. They were naked, save for swathings of scarlet cloth about the middle, and the skins were of a dull pinkish drab color, such as I had seen in no savages before. They had fat, heavy, chinless visages, retreating foreheads, and a scanned, bristly hair upon their heads. I never saw such bestial-looking creatures. They were talking, or at least one of the men was talking to the other two, and all three had been too closely interested to heed the rustling of my approach. They swayed their heads and shoulders from side to side. The speaker's words came thick and sloppy. No, I could hear them distinctly. I couldn't distinguish what he said. He seemed to me to be reciting some complicated gibberish. Presently his articulation became shriller, and spreading his hands he rose to his feet. At that the others began to gibber in unison, also rising to their feet, spreading their hands, and swaying their bodies in rhythm with their chant. I noticed in the abnormal shortness of their legs and their length clumsy feet, all three began slowly to circle round, raising and stamping their feet and waving their arms. A kind of tune crept into their rhythmic recitation, and to refrain a lula or balula, it sounded like their eyes began to sparkle, and their ugly visages to brighten with an expression of strange pleasure. Saliva dripped from their lipless mouths. Suddenly, as I watched their grotesque and unaccountable gestures, I perceived clearly for the first time what it was that had offended me, what had given me the two inconsistent and conflicting impressions of utter strangeness and yet of the strangest familiarity. The three creatures engaged in this mysterious rite were human in shape and yet human beings, with the strangest air about them of some familiar animal. Each of these creatures, despite its human form, its rag of clothing, and the rough humanity of its bodily form, had woven into its movements, into the expression of its countenance, into its whole presence, some now irresistible suggestion of a hog, a swinish taint, the unmistakable mark of the beast. I stood overcome by this amazing realization, and then the most horrible questionings came rushing into my mind. They began leaping in the air, first one and then the other, whooping and grunting. Then one slipped, and for a moment was on all fours to recover. Indeed, fought with but that transitory gleam of the true animalism of these monsters was enough. I turned as noiselessly as possible, and becoming every now and then rigid with the fear of being discovered, as a branch cracked or a leaf rustled, I pushed back into the bush. It was long before I grew bolder and dared to move freely. My only idea for the moment was to get away from these foul beings, and I scarcely noticed that I'd emerged upon a faint pathway amidst the trees. Then suddenly traversing a little glade, I saw with an unpleasant start to clumsy legs among the trees, walking with noiseless footsteps, parallel with my course, and perhaps 30 yards away from me. The head and upper part of the body were hidden by a tangle of creeper. I stopped abruptly, hoping the creature did not see me. The feet stopped as I did. So nervous was I that I controlled an impulse to headlong flight. With the utmost difficulty, then looking hard, I distinguished through the interlacing network the head and body of the brute I'd seen drinking. He moved his head. There was an emerald flash in his eyes as he glanced at me from the shadow of the trees, a half-luminous color that vanished. As he turned his head again, he was motionless for a moment, and then with a noiseless tread, began running through the green confusion. In another moment he had vanished behind some bushes. I could not see him, but I felt that he had stopped and was watching me again. What on earth was he, man or beast? What did he want with me? I had no weapon. Not even a stick. Flight will be madness, but anyway, the thing, whatever it was, lacked the courage to attack me. Setting my teeth hard, I walked straight towards him. I was anxious not to show the fear that seemed killing my backbone. I pushed through a tangle of tall white-flowered bushes. I saw him 20 paces beyond, looking over his shoulder at me, and hesitating advanced a step or two, looking steadfast into his eyes. "Who are you?" said I. He tried to meet my gaze now, he said suddenly, and turning, when bounding away from me through the undergrowth. Then he turned and stared at me again. His eyes shone brightly out of the dusk under the trees. My heart was in my mouth, but I felt my only chance was bluff, and walked steadily towards him. He turned again and vanished into the dusk once more. I thought I caught the glint of his eyes, and that was all. For the first time I realized how the lateness of the hour might affect me. The sun had set some minutes since. The swift dusk of the tropics was already fading out of the eastern sky, and the pioneer moth fluttered silently by my head, unless I would spend the night among the unknown dangers of the mysterious forest. I must hasten back the enclosure. The thought of a return to that pain-haunted refuge was extremely disagreeable, but still more so was the idea of being overtaken in the open by darkness and all the darkness might conceal. I gave one more look into the blue shadows that had swallowed up this old creature, and then retraced my way down the slope towards the stream, going as I judged in the direction from which I'd come. I walked equally, my mind confused with many things, and presently found myself in a level place among scattered trees. The colorless clearness that comes after the sunset flash was darkling. The blue sky above grew momentarily deeper, and little stars one by one pierced the attenuated light. The interspaces of the trees, the gaps in the further vegetation that have been hazy blue in the daylight, grew black and mysterious. I pushed on. The color vanished from the world. The treetops rose against the luminous blue sky, an inky silhouette, and all below, that outline melted into one formless blackness. Presently the trees grew thinner, and the shrubby undergrowth more abundant. Then there was a desolate space covered with the white sand, and then another expanse of tangled bushes. I did not remember crossing the sand opening before. I began to be tormented by a faint rustling upon my right hand. I thought at first it was fancy, but whenever I stopped there was silence, save for the evening breeze in the treetops. Then when I turned to hurry on again, there was an echo to my footsteps. I turned away from the thickets, keeping to the more open ground, and endeavoring by sudden turns now and then to surprise something in the act of creeping upon me. I saw nothing, and nevertheless my sense of another presence grew steadily. I increased my pace, and after some time came to a slight ridge, crossed it, and turned sharply, regarding its defrostly. From the other side it came out, black and clear cut against the darkling sky, and presently a shapeless lump heaved up momentarily against the skyline and vanished. Again I felt assured now that my tawny-faced antagonist was stalking me once more, and coupled with that was another unpleasant realization that I had lost my way. For a time I hurried on, hopelessly, perplexed and pursued by that stealthy approach. Whatever it was, the thing either lacked the courage to attack me, or it was waiting to take me at some disadvantage. I kept studiously to the open. At times I would turn and listen, and presently, I'd persuaded myself that my pursuer had abandoned the chase, or was a mere creation of my disordered imagination. Then I heard the sound of the sea. I quickened my footsteps almost into a run, and immediately there was a stumble in my rear. I turned suddenly and stared at the uncertain trees behind me. One black shadow seemed to leap into another. I listened rigid and heard nothing but the creep of the blood in my ears. I thought that my nerves were unstrung, and that my imagination was tricking me, and turned rhythmically towards the sound of the sea again. In a minute or so the trees grew thinner, and I emerged upon a bare low headland. Running out into the Samba water, the night was calm and clear, and reflection of the growing multitude of stars shivered in the tranquil heating of the sea. Some way out the wash, upon an irregular band of reef, shone with a pallid light of its own. Westward I saw the zodiacal light, mingling with the yellow brilliance of the evening star. The coast fell away from me to the east and westward. It was hidden by the shoulder of the cape. Then I recalled the fact that Morrow's beach, later the west. A twig snapped behind me, and I was a rustle. I turned and stood facing the dark trees. I could see nothing, or else I could see too much. Every dark form in the dimness had its ominous quality, its peculiar suggestion of alert watchfulness. So I stood for perhaps a minute, and then with the night, the tree still turned westward to cross the headland. And as I moved, one among the lurking shadows moved to follow me. My heart beat quickly. Presently, the broad sweep of a bay to the westward became visible, and I halted again. The noiseless shadow halted a dozen yards from me. A little point of light shone on the further bend of the curve, and the gray sweep of the sandy beach lay faint under the starlight. Perhaps 2 miles away, with that little point of light. To get to the beach, I should have to go through the trees, where the shadows looked, and down a bushy slope I could see the thing rather more distinctly now. It was no animal, for it's still direct. At that I opened my mouth to speak and found a horse. Phlegm choked my voice. I tried again and shouted, "Who is there?" There was no answer. I advanced a step. The thing did not move, only gathered itself together. My foot struck a stone that gave me an idea. Without taking my eyes off the black form before me, I stooped and picked up this lump of rock, put up by motion. The thing turned abruptly, as a dog might have done, and slung obliquely into the further darkness. Then I recall the schoolboy expedient against big dogs, and twisted the rock into my handkerchief, gave this a turn around my wrist. I had a movement further off among the shadows, as if the thing was in retreat. Then suddenly my tense excitement gave way. I broke into a profuse perspiration and fell a trembling, with my adversary rooted and this weapon in my hand. It was some time before I could summon resolution to go down through the trees and bushes upon the flank of the headland to the beach. At last I did it at a run, and as I emerged from the thicket upon the sand, I heard some other body come crashing after me. At that I completely lost my head with fear and began running along the sand. Forthwith that came the swift patra, soft feet in pursuit. I gave a wild cry and redoubled my pace. Some dim black things, about 3 or 4 times the size of rabbits, went running or hopping up from the beach towards the bushes as I passed. So long as I live, I shall remember the terror of that chase. I ran near the water's edge, and heard every now and then the splash of the feet gained upon me. Far away, hopelessly far, was the yellow light. All the night about us was black and still. Splash, splash came the pursuing feet. Nearer and nearer I felt my breath going. But I was quite out of training. It whooped as I drew it, and I felt a pain like a knife at my side. I perceived the thing would come up with me long before I reached the enclosure, and desperate and sobbing for my breath, I wheeled round upon it and struck at it as it came up to me. Struck with all my strength, the stone came out of the sling of the handkerchief. As I did so, as I turned, the thing which had been running on all fours rose to its feet, and the missile fell fair on its left temple. The skull rang loud, and the animal man blundered into me, thrust me back with its hands, and went staggering past me, to fall headlong upon the sand, with its face in the water, and there it lay still. I could not bring myself to approach that black heap. I left it there, with the water rippling round it under the still stars, and giving it a wide berth, pursued my way towards the yellow glow of the house. And presently, with a positive effect of relief, came the pitiful moaning of the puma, the sound that originally driven me out to explore this mysterious island. At that, though I was faint and horribly fatigued, I gathered together all my strength and began running again towards the light. I thought I heard a voice calling me. Chapter 10. The crying of the man. As I drew near the house, I saw that the light shone from the open door of my room. Then I heard coming from out of the darkness, at the side of that orange oblong of light, the voice of Montgomery shouting, "Brendick." I continued running. Presently I heard him again. I replied by a feeble hello, and in another moment had staggered up to him. "Where have you been?" said he. Held me at arm's length, so that the light from the door fell on my face. "We both been so busy that we forgot you until about half an hour ago." He let me into the room and sat me down in the deck chair. For a while I was blinded by the light. "We did not think you would start to explore this island about without telling us," he said, and then I was afraid. But what hello! My last remaining strength slipped from me, and my head fell forward on my chest. "I think you found a certain satisfaction in giving me brandy. For God's sake, should I pass in that door? You've been meeting some of our curiosities, eh?" said he. He locked the door and turned to me again. He asked me no questions, but gave me some more brandy and water, and pressed me to eat. I was in a state of collapse. He said something vague about his forgetting to warn me, and asked me briefly when I left the house and what I had seen. I answered him as briefly in fragmentary sentences. "Tell me what it all means," said I, in a state bordering on hysterics. "It's nothing so very dreadful," said he, "but I think you've had about enough." One day the puma suddenly gave a sharp yellow pain. At that he swore under his breath. "I'm damned," said he, "if this place is not as bad as Gower Street. Let's cats." "Montgomery," said I, "what was that thing that came after me? Was it a beast or was it a man? If you don't sleep tonight," he said, "you'll be off your head tomorrow." I stood up in front of him. "What was that thing that came after me?" I asked. He looked me square in the eyes and twisted his mouth askew. His eyes, which had seemed animated a minute before, went dull. "From your account," said he, "I'm thinking it was a bogle." I felt a gust of intense irritation, which passed as quickly as it came. I flung myself into the chair again and pressed my hands on my forehead. The puma began once more. Montgomery came around behind me and put his hand on my shoulder. "Look here, Prendick," he said, "I had no business to let you drift out into this silly island of ours. Was not so bad as you feel, man. Your nerves are worked to rags. Let me give you something that make you sleep, that will keep on for hours yet. You must simply get to sleep or I won't answer for it." I did not reply. I bowed forward and covered my face with my hands. Presently he returned with a small measure containing a dark liquid. This he gave me. I took it unresistingly, and he helped me into the hammock. When I woke it was broad day. For a little while I lay flat, staring at the roof above me. The rafters, I observed, were made out of the timbers of a ship. Then I turned my head and saw a meal prepared for me on the table. I perceived that I was hungry and prepared to clamber off the hammock, which very politely, and anticipating my intention, twisted round and deposited me upon all fours on the floor. I got up and sat down before the food. I had a heavy feeling in my head, and only the vague memory at first of the things that had happened overnight. Morning breeze blew very pleasantly through the unglazed window, and that and the food contributed to the sense of animal comfort which I experienced. Presently the door behind me, the door inward towards the art of the enclosure, opened. I turned and saw Montgomery's face. "All right," said he, "I'm frightfully busy," and he shut the door. Afterwards I discovered that he forgot to relock it. Then I recall the expression of his face the previous night, and with that the memory of all I had experienced reconstructed itself before me. Even as that fear came back to me, came a cry from within. But this time it was not the cry of a puma. I put down the mouthful that hesitated upon my lips. And listen, silence save for the whisper of the morning breeze. I began to think my ears had deceived me. After a long pause I resumed my meal, and with my ears still vigilant. Presently I heard something else, very faint and low. I sat as if frozen in my attitude. Though it was faint and low, it moved me more profoundly than all that I'd ever do. Heard of the abominations behind the wall. There was no mistake this time in the quality of the dim, broken sounds, no doubt at all of their source. For it was groaning broken by sobs and gasps of anguish. It was no brute this time. It was a human being in torment. As I realized this, I rose and in 3 steps across the room, seized the handle of the door into the yard, and flung it open before me. "Prendick, man, stop!" cried Montgomery, intervening. A startled deerhound yelped and snarled. Was blood I saw, and the sink, brown and some scarlet, and I smelled the peculiar smell of carbolic acid. Then thrown open doorway beyond, in the dim light of the shadow, I saw something bound painfully upon a framework, scarred red and bandaged, and then blotting this out, appeared the face of old Morrow, white and terrible in a moment. He gripped me by the shoulder. With a hand that was smeared red, he twisted me off my feet and flung me headlong back into my own room. He lifted me as though I was a little child. I fell at full length upon the floor, and the door slammed and shut out. The passionate intensity of his face. Then I heard the key turn in the lock. Montgomery's voice in expostulation. "We're in the work of a lifetime." I heard Morrow say he does not understand, said Montgomery, and other things were inaudible. I can't spare the time yet tomorrow. The rest I did not hear. I picked myself up and stood trembling, my mind a chaos of the most horrible misgivings. Could it be possible, I thought, that such a thing as the vivid section of men was carried on here? The question shot like lightning across a tumultuous sky, and suddenly the clouded horror of my mind condensed into a vivid realization of my own danger. Chapter 11: The Hunting of the Man. It came before my mind, with an unreasonable hope of escape, that the outer door of my room was still open. To me, I was convinced now, absolutely assured, that Moreau had been dissecting a human being. All the time since I had heard his name, I've been trying to link in my mind in some way the grotesque animalism of the islanders with his abominations, and now I thought I saw it all. The memory of his work on the transfusion of blood recurred to me. These creatures I had seen were the victims of some hideous experiment. The sickening scoundrels had merely intended to keep me back, to fool me with a display of confidence, and presently to fall upon me with a fate more horrible than death, with torture and after torture, the most hideous degradation it is possible to conceive, to send me off a lost soul, a beast for the rest of their coma's route. I looked around for some weapon. Nothing. Then with an inspiration, I turned over the deck chair, put my foot on the side of it, and tore away the side rail. It happened that a nail came away with the wood, and projecting, gave a touch of danger to an otherwise petty weapon. I heard a step outside and instantly flung open the door, and found Montgomery within a yard of it. He meant to lock the outer door. I raised this nailed stick of mine and cut at his face. but he sprang back. I hesitated a moment, then turned and fled round the corner of the house. "Tren Dick man," I heard this astonished cry. "Don't be a silly-ass man." Another minute, thought I, and he would have had me locked in, and as ready as a hospital rabbit for my fate. Emerged behind the corner, for I heard him shout Prendick. Then he began to run after me, shouting things as he ran, this time running blindly. I went northeastward in a direction, at right angles to my previous expedition. Once as I went running headlong up the beach, I glanced over my shoulder and saw his attendant with him. I ran furiously up the slope, over it, then turning eastward along the rocky valley, fringed on either side with jungle. I ran for perhaps a mile altogether, my chest straining, my heart beating in my ears, and then hearing nothing of Montgomery or his man, and feeling upon the verge of exhaustion, I doubled sharply back towards the beach. As I judged and lay down in the shelter of a cane brake, there I remained for a long time, too fearful to move, and indeed too fearful even to plan a course of action. A wild scene about me lays, sleeping silently under the sun, and the only sound near me was the thin hum of some small gnats that had discovered me. Presently I became aware of a drowsy breathing sound, the soughing of the sea upon the beach. After about an hour I heard Montgomery shouting my name, far away to the north. That set me thinking of my plan of action. As I interpreted it then, this island was inhabited only by these two river sectors, and their animalized victims, some of these no doubt. They could press into their service against me. If neither rose, I knew both my own Montgomery carried revolvers, and safer a feeble bar of deal, spiked with a small nail, the nearest mockery of a mace. I was unarmed, so I lay still there, until I began to think of food and drink, and at that thought, the real hopelessness of my position came home to me. I knew no way of getting anything to eat. I was too ignorant of botany to discover any resort of root or fruit that might lie about me. I had no means of trapping the few rabbits upon the island. It grew blanker the more I turned the prospect over. At last, in the desperation of my position, my mind turned to the animal man I had encountered. I tried to find some hope in what I remembered of them. In turn, I recalled each one I had seen and tried to draw some augury of assistance from my memory. And suddenly I heard a staghound bay, and at that realized a new danger. I took little time to think, or they would have caught me. Then, but snatching up my nailed stick, rushed headlong from my hiding place towards the sound of the sea. I remember a growth of thorny plants with spines that stamped like pen knives. I emerged bleeding and with torn clothes upon the lip of a long creek opening northward. I went straight into the water without a minute hesitation, wading up the creek, and presently, finding myself knee-deep in a little stream, I scrambled out last on the westward bank, with my heart beating loudly in my ears, crept into a tangle of ferns to await the issue. I heard the dog, there was only one, draw nearer and yelp when it came to the thorns. Then I heard no more, and presently began to think I'd escaped. The minutes passed, the silence lengthened out, and at last, after an hour of security, my courage began to return to me. By this time, I was no longer very much terrified or very miserable. I had, as it were, passed the limit of terror and despair. I felt now that my life was practically lost, and that persuasion made me capable of daring anything. I had even a certain wish to encounter Morrow, face to face, and as I had waded into the water, I remembered that if I were too hard pressed, at least one part of escape from torment still lay open to me. They could not very well prevent my drowning myself. I had half of mind to drown myself. Then, but an odd wish to see the whole adventure out, a queer, impersonal, spectacular interest in myself, restrained me. I stretched my limbs, sore and painful from the pricks of the spiny plants, and stared around me at the trees, and so suddenly that it seemed to jump out of the green tracery about it. My eyes lit upon a black face watching me. I saw that it was the simian creature who had met the launch upon the beach. He was clinging to the oblique stem of a palm tree. I gripped my stick and stood up facing him. He began chattering you was all I could distinguish at first. Suddenly he dropped from the tree, and in another moment was holding the fronds apart and staring curiously at me. I did not feel the same repugnance towards this creature which I'd experienced to my encounters with the other beast. Manu, he said in the boat. He was a man then, at least as much of a man as Montgomery's attendant, where he could talk. Yes, I said. I came in the boat from the ship, oh, he said, and his bright restless eyes traveled over me, to my hands to the stick I carried, to my feet to the tattered places in my coat, and the cuts and scratches I'd received from the thorns. He seemed puzzled at something. His eyes came back to my hands. He held his own hand out and counted his digits slowly, 1 to 3, for 5. 8. I did not grasp his meaning. Then afterwards, I was to find that a great proportion of these beast people had malformed hands, lacking sometimes even 3 digits. But guessing this was in some way greeting, I did the same thing by way of reply. He grinned with immense satisfaction. Then his swift roving glance went round again. He made a swift movement and vanished. The fern fronds he had stood between came swishing together. I pushed out of the break after him and was astonished to find him swinging cheerfully by one lang arm from a rope of creepers that looped down from the foliage overhead. His back was to me. Hello, said I. He came down with twisting jump and stood facing me. I say, said I, where can I get something to eat? Eat, he said. Eat man's food now. And as I went back to the swing of ropes at the huts. But where are the huts, oh? I'm new, you know that. He swung round and set off at a quick walk. All his motions were curiously rapid. Come along, said he. I went with him to see the adventure out. I guess the huts were some rough shelter where he and some more of these beast people lived. I might perhaps find them friendly, find some handle in their minds to take hold of. I did not know how far they'd forgotten their human heritage. My ape-like companion trotted along by my side, with his hands hanging down and his jaw thrust forward. I wonder what memory he might have in him. How long have you been on this island to die? How long, he asked, and after having the question repeated, he held up 3 fingers. The creature was little better than an idiot. I tried to make out what he meant by that, and it seems I bought him. After another question or two, he suddenly left my side, went leaping at some fruit that hung from a tree. He pulled down a handful of prickly husks, went on eating the contents. I noticed this was satisfaction, but here at least was a hint for feeding. I tried him with some other questions, but his chattering prompt responses was often as not quite across purposes with my question. Some few were appropriate, others quite parrot-like. I was so intent upon these peculiarities that I scarcely noticed the path we followed. Presently we came to trees all charred and brown, and so do a bare place covered with the yellow white incrustation cross which a drifting smoke, pungent and whiffs to nose and eyes. When drifting on our right over a shoulder-bare rock, I saw the level blue of the sea. The path coiled down abruptly into a narrow ravine, between two tumbled and knotty masses of blackish scurry. Into this we plunged. It was extremely dark, this passage. After blinding sunlight, reflected from the sulphurous ground, its walls grew steep and approached each other. Blotches of green and crimson drifted across my eyes. My conductor stopped suddenly. Home city, and I stood in a floor of a chasm that was, at first, absolutely dark to me. I heard some strange noises, and thrust the knuckles of my left hand into my eyes. I became aware of a disagreeable odor, like that of a monkey's cage ill-cleaned. Beyond, the rock opened again, upon a gradual slope of sunlit greenery, and on either hand, the lights smoked down through narrow ways, into the central gloom. Chapter 12. The Sayers of the Law. Then something cold touched my hand. I started violently and saw close to me a dim, pinkish thing looking more like a flayed child. Than anything else in the world, the creature had exactly the mild, but repulsive features of a sloth. The same low forehead and slow gestures. As the first shock of the change of light passed, I saw about me more distinctly the little, sloth-like creature was standing and staring at me. My conductor had vanished. The place was a narrow passage, between high walls of lava, a crack in the knotted rock, and on either side interwoven heaps of cement. Palm fans and reeds leaning against the rock formed rough and impenetrable, dark dens. The winding way of the ravine between these was scarcely 3 yards wide and was disfigured by lumps of decaying fruit, pulp and other refuse which accounted for the disagreeable stench of the place. The little, pink sloth creature was still blinking at me when my ape man reappeared at the aperture of the nearest of these dens and beckoned me in. As you did so, a slouching monster wriggled out of one of the places further up the strange street and stood up in featureless silhouette against the bright green beyond, staring at me. I hesitated, having half a mind to bolt the way I had come, and then determined to go through with the adventure. I gripped my nailed stick about the middle and crawled into the little, evil-smelling lean-to after my conductor. It was a semicircular space, shaped like the half of a beehive, and against the rocky wall that formed the inner side of it was a pile of variegated fruits. Coconuts among others, some rough vessels of lava and wood stood about the floor and one on a rough stool. There was no fire in the darkest corner of the hut. Shatter shapeless, massive darkness that grunted hay. As I came in, my ape man stood in the dim, like the doorway, and held out a spit coconut to me. As I crawled into the other corner and squatted down, I took it and began gnawing it as serenely as possible. In spite of a certain trepidation and the nearly intolerable closeness of the den, the little, pink sloth creature stood in the aperture of the hut, and something else, with a drab face and luminous gaze came. Staring over its shoulder, hay came out of the lump of mystery opposite. "It is a man, it is man," gabbled my conductor. A man, a 5-man like me." "Shut up," said the voice from the dark and grunted. I gnawed my coconut amid an impressive stillness, peered hard into the blackness, but could distinguish nothing. "It is a man," the voice repeated. "He comes to live with us." It was a thick voice with something in it, a kind of whistling overtone that struck me as peculiar, but the English accent was strangely good. The ape-man looked at me as though he expected something. I perceived the pause was interrogative. "He comes to live with you," I said. "It is a man. He must learn the law." I began to distinguish now a deeper blackness in the black of vague outline of a hunched-up figure. Then I noticed the opening of the place was darkened by 2 more blackheads. My hand tightened on my stick. The thing in the dark repeated in a louder tone, "Say the words." I have missed its last remark. "Not to go on all fours, that is the law," it repeated in a kind of sing-song. I was puzzled. "Say the words," said the ape-man, repeating, and the figures in the doorway echoed this with a threat in the tone of their voices. I realized that I had to repeat this idiotic formula, and then began the insaneness ceremony. The voice in the dark began intoning a mad litany, line by line, and I and the rest to repeat it. As they did so, they swayed from side to side in the oddest way, and beat their hands upon their knees, and I followed their example. I could have imagined I was already dead and in another world. That dark hut, these grotesque, dim figures, just flicked here and there by a glimmer of light, and all of them swaying in unison and chanting, "Not to go on all fours, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to suck up drink, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to eat fish or flesh, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to claw the bark of trees, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to chase other men, that is the law. Are we not men?" And so from the prohibition of these acts of folly onto the prohibition of what I thought Then were the maddest, most impossible, and most indecent things one could well imagine. The kind of rhythmic further fell on all of us. We gabbled and swayed faster and faster, repeating this amazing law. Superficially, the contagion of these brutes was upon me, but deep down within me, the laughter and disgust struggled together. We ran through a long list of prohibitions, and then the chance swung round to a new formula. His is the house of pain. His is the hand that makes. His is the hand that wounds. His is the hand that he used, and so on for another long series. Mostly quite incomprehensible gibberish to me about him. Whoever he might be, I could have fancied it was a dream. But never before have I heard chanting in a dream. His is the lightning flash, we sang. His is the deep salt sea. Horrible fancy came into my head that Moreau, after animalizing these men, had infected their dwarf brains with the kind of deification of himself. However, I was too keenly aware of white teeth and strong claws about me to stop by chanting on that account. Here's all the stars in the sky. At last that song ended. I saw the ape man's face shining with perspiration, and my eyes being now accustomed to the darkness, I saw more distinctly the figure in the corner from which the voice came. It was the size of a man, but it seemed covered with a dull gray hair, almost like a sky terrier. What was it? What were they all? Imagine yourself surrounded by all the most horrible cripples and maniacs it is possible to conceive, and you may understand a little of my feelings with these grotesque caricatures of humanity. About me he is a five-man like me. So the ape-man, I held out my hands. The gray creature in the corner leant forward, not to run on all fours, that is the law. Are we not men? He put out a strangely distorted talon and gripped my fingers. The thing was almost like the hoof of a deer, produced into claws. I could have yelled with surprise and pain. His face came forward and peered at my nails, came forward in the light of the opening of the hut, and I saw with a quivering disgust that it was like the face of neither man nor beast, but a mere shock of gray hair with three shadowy overarchings to mark the eyes and mouth. He has little nails set, this grisly creature. In his hairy bearded as well. He threw my hand down, and instinctively I gripped my stick. Eat roots and herbs, it is his will. So the ape man, I am the sail of the law. Said the gray figure, here come all the bean. You to learn the law. I sit in the darkness and say the law. And there's even sound, said one of the beasts in the doorway. Evil are the punishments of those who break the law. None escape to the beast. Folk glancing furtively one another, none to the ape man not escape. See, I did a little thing, wrong thing once, I jab it. Stop talking now, could understand. I am bird branched in the head. He is great, he is good. Escape, said the gray creature in the corner. Escape, said the beast. People looking askance at one another for everyone. The one that is bad, said the gray sayer of the law. What you will want we do not know, we shall know. Someone to follow things that move, to watch and slink and wait and spring to kill and bite. Bite deep and rich, sucking the blood. It is bad not to chase other men. That is the law, are we not men? Not to eat fresh or fish, that is the law. Are we not men? None. Escape to the dappled brutes standing in the doorway, for everyone the want is bad, said the grace say of the law. Someone to go tearing with teeth and hands into the roots of things, snuffing into the earth. It is bad landscape to the man in the door. Some go growing trees. Some go scratching at the graves of the dead. Some go fighting with foreheads or fetal claws. Some bite suddenly, none. Giving occasion some love and cleanness, no escape. So the ape man scratching his cough and escape. So the little pink sloth creature. Punishment is sharp and sore, therefore. Say the words, and incontinently he began again the strange litany of the law, and again I and all these creatures began singing and swaying. My head reeled with this jabbering in the close stench of the place, but I kept on trusting to find presently some chance of a new development. Not to go on or force, that is the law, are we not men? We were making such a noise that I noticed nothing about Tuna outside, till someone, who I think was one of the swine men I had seen, thrust his head over the little pink sloth creature and shouted something excitedly, something that I did not catch, and constantly. Those are the opening of the hut vanished. My ape man rushed out. The thing that had sat in the dark followed him. I only observed that it was big and clumsy and covered with silvery hair, and I was left alone. Then before I reached the aperture, I heard the yelp of a staghound. In another moment, I was standing outside the hovel, my chair rail in my hand, every muscle of me quivering before me, with the clumsy backs of perhaps a score of these beast people, their misshapen heads, half hidden by their shoulder blades. They were gesticulating excitedly, other half-animal visages glared interrogation out of the hovels. Looking in the direction in which they faced, I saw coming, through the haze under the trees, beyond the end of the passage of dens, the dark figure and awful white face, a Morrow. He was holding the leaping staghound back, and close behind him came Montgomery, revolver in hand. For a moment I stood horror-struck. I turned and saw the passage behind me, blocked by another heavy brute with a huge, gray face and twinkling little eyes, advancing towards me, hello ground, and sort of the right of me, and a half-dozen yards in front of me, a narrow gap in the wall of rock, through which a ray of light slanted into the shadows. Stop, cried Morrow, as I strode towards this, and then held him. And that first one face turned towards me, and then others. The best your minds were happily slow. I dashed my shoulder into a clumsy monster, who was turning to see what Moreau meant, and flung him forward into another. I felt his hands fly around, clutching at me. And missing me, the little pink sloth creature dashed at me, and I gashed down its ugly face with the nail in my stick, and in another minute was scrambling up a steep side pathway, the kind of sloping chimney out of the ravine. I heard a howl behind me and cries of catch him, hold him, and the gray-faced creature appeared behind me and jammed his huge bulk into the cleft. Go on, go on. They held. I clambered up the narrow cleft in the rock and came out upon the sulphur on the westward side of the village of the beast men. That gap was altogether fortunate for me, for the narrow chimney slanting obliquely upward must have impeded the nearer pursuers. I ran over the white space and down a steep slope, through a scattered growth of trees, and came to a low-lying stretch of tall reeds, through which I pushed into a dark, thick undergrowth that was black and succulent underfoot. As I plunged into the reeds, my former pursuers emerged from the gap. I broke my way through this undergrowth. For some minutes, the air behind me and about me was soon full of threatening cries. I heard the tumors of my pursuers in the gap, up the slope, then the crashing of the reeds, and every now and then the crackling crash of a branch. Some of the creatures roared like excited beasts of prey. The staghound yelped to the left. I heard Montgomery shouting in the same direction. I turned sharply to the right. It seemed to me even then that I heard Montgomery shouting for me to run for my life. Presently the ground gave rich and oozy under my feet, but I was desperate and went headlong into it, struggled through knee-deep, and so came to a winding path among tall canes. The noise of my pursuers passed away to my left. In one place 3 strange, pink-hopping animals about the size of cats bolted before my footsteps. This pathway ran uphill across another open space, covered with white incrustation, and plunged into a cane break again. Then suddenly, it turns parallel with the edge of a steep-walled gap, which came without warning like the ha of an English park, turned with an unexpected abruptness. I was still running with all my might, and I never saw this drop, until I was flying headlong through the air. I fell on my forearms and head among thorns, and rose with a torn ear and bleeding face. I had fallen into a precipitous ravine, rocky and thorny. full of a hazy mist which drifted about me in wisps, and with a narrow streamlet from which this mist came, meandering down the center. I was astonished at this thin fog, in the full blaze of daylight, but I had no time to stand wondering. Then I turned to my right downstream, hoping to come to the sea, in that direction, and so have my way open to drown myself. It was only later I found that I had dropped my nail stick in my fall. Presently the ravine grew narrower for a space, and carelessly I stepped into the stream. I jumped out again pretty quickly, but the water was almost boiling. I noticed too, there was a thin, sulphurous scum drifting upon its cooling water. Almost immediately came a turn in the ravine, and the indistinct blue horizon. The nearest sea was flashing the sun from a myriad facets. I saw my death before me, but I was hot and panting, with the warm blood oozing out on my face and running pleasantly through my veins. I felt more than a touch of exultation too, and having distanced my pursuers. It was not in me then to go out and drown myself. Yet I stared back the way I had come. I listened safe for the hum of the gnats, and the chirp of some small insects that hopped. Among the thorns, the air was absolutely still. Then came the yelp of a dog, very faint, and a chattering and gibbering. The snap of a whip and voices. They grew louder, then fainter again. The noise receded up the stream and faded away. For a while the chase was over, but I knew now how much hope of help for me lay. In the Beast People, Chapter 30, Nepali. I turned again and went on down towards the sea. I found the hot stream broadened out to a shallow, weedy sand, in which an abundance of crabs and long-bodied, many-legged creatures started from my footfall. I walked to the very edge of the salt water, and then I felt I was safe. I turned and stared arms akimbo at the thick green behind me, into which the steamy ravine cut like a smoking gash. But as I say, I was too full of excitement, and a true saying, though those who have never known danger may doubt it, too desperate to die. Then it came into my head that there was one chance before me yet. While Morrow Montgomery and their bestial rebel chased me through the island, might I not go round the beach until I came to their enclosure, make a flank march upon them, in fact, and then, with a rock logged out of their loosely built wall, perhaps smash in the lock of the smaller door, and see what I could find, knife, pistol, or what not, to fight them with when they returned. It wasn't anyway something to try. So I turned to the westward and walked along, by the water's edge. The setting sun flashed his blinding heat into my eyes. The slight Pacific tide was running in. With a gentle ripple presently, the shore fell away southward, and the sun came round upon my right hand. Then suddenly far in front of me, I saw first one, and then several figures emerging from the bush. Moreau with his gray staghound, then Montgomery and two others. At that I stopped. They saw me and began gesticulating and advancing. I stood watching them approach. The beast men came running forward to cut me off from the undergrowth. Inland Montgomery came running also, but straight towards me. Moreau followed slower with his dog. At last, I roused myself from my inaction and turning seaward, walked straight into the water. What was very shallow at first, I was 30 yards out, before the waves reached to my waist. Dimly I could see the intertidal creatures darting away from my feet. "What you doing, man?" cried Montgomery. I turned, standing waist deep, and stared at them. Montgomery stood panting at the margin of the water. His face was bright red with exertion, his long flax and hair blown about his head, and his dropping never lip showed his irregular teeth. Morrow was just coming up, his face pale and firm, and the dog in his hand barked at me. Those men had heavy whips. Farther out the beach stared the beast. "Man, what am I doing? I'm going to drown myself," said I. Montgomery and Morrow looked at each other. "Why?" asked Morrow. "Because that is better than being tortured by you." "I killed you so," said Montgomery, and Morrow said something in a low tone. "What makes you think I should torture you?" "Osmoro, what I saw," I said. "And those yonder." "Hush," said Morrow. He held up His hand, I will not said I they were men, what are they now? I at least will not be like them. I looked past my interlocutors. Up the beach were Mling Montgomery's attendant, and one of the white Swade's brutes from the boat, farther up in the shadow of the trees. I saw my little 8-man, behind him some other dim figures. Who are these creatures, said I, pointing to them and raising my voice more and more, that it might reach them. They were men like yourselves, whom you have infected with some bestial taint, men whom you have enslaved and whom you still fear. You who listen, I cried, pointing now to Morrow, and shouting past him to the beast man. You listen, do not see these men still fear you? Go in dread of you, why then do you fear them? You are many, for God's sake. Cry Montgomery, stop that panic, Brendick, cry Morrow. They both shouted together as if to drown my voice. Behind them lowered the staring visages of the beast men, wondering, the deformed hands hanging down, the shoulders hunched up. They seemed, as I fancied, to be trying to understand me, to remember, I thought, something of their human past. I went on shouting, I scarcely remember what. That Morrow and Montgomery could be killed, that they were not be feared. That was the burden of what I put into the heads of the beast. People I saw, the green-eyed man in the dark rags, who had met me on the evening of my arrival, come out from among the trees, and others followed him to hear me better. At last, for once a breath, I paused. Listen to me for a moment, to the steady voice in a row, and then say what you will. Well, said I, he coughed thought, and then shouted, Latin, Brendick. Bad Latin, schoolboy Latin, but try and understand. High non santa hominis santa animal, yeah. Keen as heavimos of vivisected, humanizing process. I will explain, come ashore. I laughed. Pretty story, said I, they talk build houses. They were men, it's likely I'll come ashore. The water just beyond where you stand is deep and full of sharks, that's my way. Said I, short and sharp, presently, wait a minute. He took something out of his pocket that flashed back the sun, and dropped the object at his feet. That's a loaded revolver. Said he, Montgomery here will do the same. Now we're going up the beach, until you're satisfied the distance is safe. Then come and take the revolvers, not lie you have a third between you. I want you to think over things, Brendick. In the first place, I never asked you to come upon this island. If we vivisected men, we should import men, not beasts. In the next, we had you drunk last night. Had we wanted to work you any mischief, and in the next. Now your first panic is over, and you can think a little. Is Montgomery here? Quite up to the character you give him. We've chased you for your good, because this island is full of inimical phenomena. Besides, why should we want to shoot you when you just offered to drown yourself? Why did you set your people onto me? When I was in the hut, we felt sure of catching you and bringing you out of danger. Afterwards, we drew away from the scent for your good. I mused, it seemed just possible. Then I remembered something again, but I saw, said I, an enclosure. That was the Puma. Look here, Pendick, said Montgomery, you're a silly ass. Come out of the water and take these revolvers and talk. We can't do anything more than we could do now. I will confess that then, and indeed always, I distrusted and dreaded Moreau. But Montgomery was a man I felt understood. Go up the beach, said I, after thinking, and added, holding your hands up. Can't do that. To Montgomery with an explanatory nod, every shoulder undidified. Go up to the trees, then, said I, as you please. It's a damn chilly ceremony, said Montgomery. Both turned and faced the 6 or 7 grotesque creatures, who stood there in the sunlight, solid, casting shadows, moving and yet so incredibly unreal. Montgomery cracked his whip at them, and forthwith they all turned and fled, held a skeleton into the trees. And when Montgomery and Moreau were at a distance, I judged sufficient, I waded ashore and picked up and examined the revolvers to satisfy myself against the subtlest trickery. I discharged one at a round lump of lava and have the satisfaction of seeing the stone pulverized and the beach splashed with lead. Still I hesitated for a moment. I'll take the risk. said I at last, and with the revolver in each hand. I walked up the beach towards them. That's better tomorrow without hesitation. As it is, you've wasted the best part of my day with your confounded imagination, and with a touch of contempt which humiliated me here. Montgomery turned and went on in silence before me. The knot of beast men, still wandering, stood back among the trees. I passed them as serenely as possible. One started to follow me, but retreated again when Montgomery cracked his whip. The rest stood silent, watching. They may once have been animals, but I never before saw an animal trying to think. Chapter 14. Dr. Morrow explains. And now Prindick. I will explain to Dr. Morrow so soon as we've eaten and drunk. I must confess that you are the most dictatorial guest I ever entertained. I warn you that this is the last I shall do to oblige you. The next thing you threaten to commit suicide about, I shan't do even at some personal inconvenience. He sat in my deck chair, a cigar half consumed in his white, dexterous-looking fingers. The light of the swinging lamp fell on his white hair. He stared through the little window, out of the starlight. I sat as far away from him as possible. The table between us and the revolvers to hand. Montgomery was not present. I did not care to be with the two of them in such a little room. You admit that the vivisected human being, as you call it, is after all only the puma Samero. He had made me visit that horror in the inner room to assure myself of it in humanity. It is the puma, I said, still alive, but so cut and mutilated as I pray I may never see living flesh again. Of all vile, never mind that Samero. At least spare me those youthful horrors. Montgomery used to be just the same. You admit that it is the puma. Now be quiet while I reel off my physiological lecture to you. And forthwith, beginning in the tone of a man supremely bored, but presently warming a little, he explained his work to me. It was very simple, and commencing now and then. There was a touch of sarcasm in his voice. Presently, I find myself hot with shame at our mutual positions. The creatures I'd seen were not men, had never been men, they were animals. Humanized animals triumphs vivisection. You forget all that a skilled vivisector can do. With living things tomorrow, my own part I'm puzzled by. The things I've done here have not been done before. Small efforts, of course, have been made. Amputation, tongue-cutting excisions, of course, you know. A squint may be induced or cured by surgery. Then in the case of excisions, you have all kinds of secondary changes. Pigmentary dyshedrapses, modifications of the passions, alterations in the secretion of fatty tissue. I have no doubt you've heard of these things. Of course, said I, but these foul creatures of yours, all in good time, said he, waving his hand at me. I'm only beginning. Those are trivial cases of alteration. Surgery can do better things than that. There is building up, as well as breaking down and changing. You heard perhaps of a common surgical operation resorted to in cases where the nose has been destroyed. A flap of skin is cut from the forehead, turned down on the nose, and heals in the new position. This is a kind of drafting in a new position of part of an animal upon itself. Grafting of freshly obtained material from another animal is also possible. The case of teeth, for example. The grafting of skin and bone is done to facilitate healing. The surgeon places in the middle of the wound pieces of skin snipped from another animal, or fragments of bone from a victim, freshly killed hunter's Cocksburg. Perhaps you heard of that, flourished on the bull's neck, and the rhinoceros. Rats of the Algerian Zouabies are also to be thought of. Monsters manufactured by transferring a slip from the tail of an ordinary rat to its snout and allowing it to heal in that position. Monsters manufactured, said I. Then you mean to tell me, yes, these creatures you have seen are animals, carven and wrought into new shapes. To the study of the plasticity of living forms, my life has been devoted. I've studied for years, gaining a knowledge as I go. I see you look horrified, yet I'm telling you nothing. Knew it all lay in the surface of practical anatomy years ago, but no one had the temerity to touch it. It is not simply the outward form of an animal, which I can change the physiology, the chemical rhythm of the creature, may also be made to undergo an enduring modification, of which vaccination and other methods of inoculation with living or dead matter are examples that will no doubt be familiar. To a similar operation is the transfusion of blood, with which subject indeed I began. These are all familiar cases, less so and probably far more extensive, with the operations of those medieval practitioners who made dwarves and beggar cripples, show monsters some vestiges of whose art still remain in the preliminary manipulation of the young. Mountebank or contortionist, Victor Hugo gives an account of them in Long Kiwi. Perhaps my meaning grows plain. Now you begin to see that it is a possible thing to transplant tissue from one part of an animal to another, or from one animal to another, to alter its chemical reactions and methods of growth, to modify the articulation of its limbs, and indeed to change it in its most intimate structure. And yet this extraordinary branch of knowledge has never been sold as an end, and systematically by modern investigators. Until I took it up, some such things have been hit upon. In the last resort of surgery, most of the kindred evidence that will recur to your mind has been demonstrated, as it were by accident, by tyrants, by criminals, by the breeders of horses and dog, by all kinds of untrained, clumsy-handed men working for their own immediate ends. I was the first man to take up this question, armed with antiseptic, surgery, and with the really scientific knowledge of the laws of growth. We had, one would imagine, it must have been practiced in secret before. Such creatures as the Siamese twins, and in the vaults of the Inquisition. No doubt their chief aim was artistic torture, but some at least of the inquisitors must have had a touch of scientific curiosity. But said I these things, these animals talk? He said that was so, and proceeded to point out that the possibility of vivisection does not stop at a mere physical metamorphosis. A pig may be educated. The mental structure is even less determined than the bodily. In our growing signs of hypnotism, we find the promise of a possibility of superseding old inherent instincts by new suggestions, grafting upon or replacing the inherited fixed ideas. Very much indeed what we call moral education, he said, is such an artificial modification and perversion of instinct. Pugnacity is trained into courageous self-sacrifice, and suppressed sexuality into religious emotion. And the great difference between man and monkey is in the larynx, he continued, in the incapacity to frame delicately different sound, symbols by which thought could be sustained. In this I failed to agree with him, but with a certain incivility. He declined to notice my objection. He repeated that the thing was so, and continued his account of his work. I asked him why he had taken the human form as a model. They seemed to me then, and they still seems to me now, a strange wickedness for that choice. They confessed that he had chosen that form by accident. I might just as well at work to form sheep into llamas, and llamas into sheep. I suppose there is something in the human form that appeals to the artistic turn of mind more powerfully than any animal shape can, but I'm not confined myself to man-making. Or once or twice he was silent for a minute. Pat, these years, how they have slipped by. And here I've wasted a day saving your life, and now wasting an hour explaining myself. But said I still do not understand. Where's your justification for inflicting all this pain? The only thing that could excuse vivisection to me will be some application precisely, Teddy, but you see, I am differently constituted. We are on different platforms. You are a materialist, I am not a materialist. I began hotly in my view, but it is just this question of pain that parts us. So long as visible or audible pain turns you sick, so long as your own pains drive you, so long as pain underlies your propositions about sin, so long I tell you, you are an animal. Thinking a little less obscurely about what an animal feels this pain, I gave in Impatient shrug at such sophistry. Oh, but it is such a little thing. A mind truly open to what science has to teach must see that it is a little thing. It may be that saving this little planet, this speck of cosmic dust, invisible along with all the nearest star, can be attained. It may be, I say, that nowhere else does this thing called pain occur, but the laws we feel our way towards. Why, even on this earth, even among living things, what pain is. There, as he spoke, he drew a little pen knife from his pocket, opened the smaller blade, and moved his chair so that I could see his thigh. Then, choosing the place deliberately, he drove the blade into his leg and withdrew it. No doubt, he said, you have seen that before. It does not hurt a pinprick, but what does it show? The capacity for pain is not needed in the muscle, and it is not placed. There is but little needed in the skin, and only here and there, over the thigh, is a spot capable of feeling pain. Pain is simply our intrinsic medical advisor, to warn us and stimulate us. Not all living flesh is painful, nor is all nerve, not even all sensory nerve. There's no taint of pain. Real pain in the sensations of the optic nerve. You wound the optic nerve, you merely see flashes of light. Just as disease of the auditory nerve merely means a humming in our ears. Plants do not feel pain, nor the lower animals. It's possible that such animals, of the starfish and crayfish, do not feel pain at all. Then with men, the more intelligent they become, the more intelligently they will see after their own welfare, and the less they will need the goat to keep them out of danger. I never yet heard of a useless thing that was not ground out of existence by evolution. Sooner or later, did you, and pain gets needless. Then I'm a religious man, pendic as every sane man must be. It may be I fancy that I've seen more of the ways of this world's maker than you, but I have saw his laws in my way all my life, while you understand have been collecting butterflies. And I tell you, pleasure and pain have nothing to do with heaven or hell. Pleasure and pain. What is your theologian's ecstasy but Muhammad's holy in the dark? The store which men and women set on pleasure and pain, Brendick, is the mark of the beast upon them. The mark of the beast from which they came. Pain and pleasure. They are for us only so long as we wriggle in the dust. You see, I went on with this research just the way it led me. That is the only way I ever heard of true research. Going, I asked a question, devised some method of obtaining an answer, and got a fresh question. Was this possible or that possible? You cannot imagine what this means to an investigator, what an intellectual passion grows upon him. You cannot imagine the strange, colorless delight these intellectual desires. I think before you is no longer an animal, a fellow creature, but a problem, sympathetic pain. All I know of it, I remember, is a thing I used to suffer from years ago. I wanted, it was the one thing I wanted to find out, the extreme limit of plasticity in a living shape, but said I, the thing is an abomination. To this day, I have never troubled about the ethics of the matter. He continued, the study of nature makes a man at last as remorseless as nature. I have gone on, not hitting anything but the question I was pursuing, and the material has dripped into the huts yonder. It is nearly 11 years since we came here. I in Montgomery and 6 Kanakers. I remember the green stillness of the island and the empty ocean about us. At Hope was yesterday. The place seemed waiting for me. The stores were landed and the house was built. The Kanakers founded some huts near the ravine. I went to work here upon what I brought with me. There were some disagreeable things happened at first. I began with a sheep and killed it after a day and a half. By slip of the scalpel, I took another sheep and made a thing of pain and fear. Left it bound up to heal. It looked quite human to me when I had finished it, but when I went to it, I was discontented with it. It remembered me and was terrified beyond imagination, and it had no more than the wits of a sheep. The more I looked at it, the clumsier it seemed, until at last I put the monster out of its misery. These animals without courage, these fear-haunted, pain-driven things, without a spark of pugnacious energy to face torment. There are no good for man-making. Then I took a gorilla I had, and upon that, working with infinite care and mastering difficulty after difficulty, I made my first man. All the week, night and day, I molded him. With him it was chiefly the brain that needed building. Much had to be added, much changed. I thought him a fair specimen of the Negroid type. When I finished him and he lay bandaged, bound and motionless before me, it was only when his life was assured that I left him and came into this room again, and found Montgomery much as you are. He had heard some of the cries as the thing grew, human cries like those that disturb you. So I didn't take him completely into my confidence at first, and the Kanakers too had realized something of it. They were scared out of their wits by the sight of me. I got Montgomery over to me in a way, but and he had the hardest job, to prevent the Kanakers deserting. Finally they did, and so we lost the yacht. I spent many days educating the brute altogether. I had him for 3 or 4 months. I told him the rudiments of English, gave him ideas of counting, even made the thing read the alphabet. But at that he was slow, though I met with idiots slower. He began with a clean sheet, mentally, had no memories left in his mind of what he had been when his scars were quite healed, and he was no longer anything but painful and stiff and able to converse. A little, I took him yonder and introduced him to the Kanakers as an interesting stowaway. They were horribly afraid of him at first somehow, which offended me rather, for I was conceited about him. But his ways seemed so mild, and he was so abject, that after a time, they received him and took his education in hand. He was quick to learn, very imitative and adaptive, and built himself a hovel, rather better it seemed to me, than their own shanties. There was one among the boys, a bit of a missionary, and he taught a thing to read, or at least to pick out letters, and gave him some rudimentary ideas of morality. But it seems the beast habits were not all that is desirable. I rested from work for some days after this, and was in a mind to write an account of the whole affair, to wake up English physiology. Then I came upon the creature squatting up in a tree and gibbering at 2 of the Kanakers who've been teasing him. I threatened him, told him the inhumanity of such proceeding, aroused his sense of shame, and came home resolved to do better. Before I took my work back to England, I have been doing better. But somehow the things drift back again. The stubborn beast flesh grows day by day back again. But I mean to do better things still. I mean to conquer that. This puma, but that's the story. All the Kanaka boys are dead. Now, one fell overboard at the launch, and one died of a wounded heel that he poisoned in somewhere with plant juice. 3 went away in the yacht, and I suppose, and hope were drowned. The other one was killed. Well, I have replaced them, Montgomery went on, much as you were disposed to do at first. And then what became of the other one? Said I sharply. The other Kanaka who was killed. The fact is, after I had made a number of human creatures, I made a thing. He hesitated. Yes, said I, he was killed. I don't understand, said I. Do you mean to say it killed the Kanaka? Yes, it killed several other things. At the court we chased it for a couple of days. It only got loose by accident. I never meant it to get away. It wasn't finished, it was purely an experiment. It was a limbless thing with a horrible face that riots along the ground in a serpentine fashion. It was immensely strong and in infuriating pain. It lurked in the woods for some days until we hunted it. And then it wriggled into the northern part of the island, and we divided the party to close in upon it. Montgomery insisted upon coming with me. The man had a rifle, and when his body was found, one of the barrels was curved into the shape of an S and very nearly bitten through. Montgomery shot the thing. After that I stuck the ideal of humanity, except the little things. He became silent. I sat in silence watching his face. So for 20 years altogether, counting 9 years in England, I have been going on. And there's still something in everything I do. that defeats me makes me dissatisfied, challenges me to further effort. Sometimes I rise above my level, sometimes I fall below it, but always I fall short of the things I dream. The human shape I can get now almost with ease, so that it is lithe and graceful, or thick and strong, but often there is trouble with the hands and the claws. Painful things that I dare not shape to freely. But it is in the subtle grafting and reshaping one must. Needs due to the brain that my trouble lies. The intelligence is often oddly low, with unaccountable blank ends, unexpected gaps. The least satisfactory of all is something that I cannot touch. Somewhere I cannot determine where, in the seat of the emotions. Cravings, instincts, desires that harm humanity. A strange hidden reservoir to burst forth suddenly and inundate the whole being of the creature. With anger, hate, or fear, these creatures of mine seemed strange. None can it to you so soon as you began to observe them, but to me just after I make them. They seem to be indisputably human beings. It's afterwards, as I observe them, that the persuasion fades. Burst one animal trait, then another creeps to the surface and stares out of me, but I will conquer yet, each time. I dip a living creature into the bath of burning pain. I say this time I will burn out all the animal. This time I will make a rational creature of my own. After all, what is 10 years may have been 100,000 in the making. He thought darkly, but I am drawing near the fastness this puma of mine. After silence, and they revert. As soon as my hand is taken from them, the beast begins to creep back, begins to assert itself again. Another long silence. Then you take the things you make into those dens, said I, they go. I turn them out when I begin to feel the beast in them. And presently they wander there. They all dread this house and me. There's a kind of travesty of humanity over there. Montgomery knows about it, for he interferes in their affairs. He has trained one or two of them to our service. He's ashamed of it. But I believe he hath like some of those beasts. It's his business, not mine. They only sicken me with a sense of failure. I take no interest in them. I fancy they're following the lines the Kanakon missionary marked out, and have a kind of mockery of irrational life. Poor beasts, there's something they call the law. Sing hymns about all vine, they build themselves their dens. Gather fruit and pull herbs, merry even, but I can see through it all. See, and their very souls. And see they're nothing but the souls of beasts, beast of perish. Anger and the lust to live and gratify themselves. Yet they are odd complex, like everything else alive. There's a kind of upward striving in them. Part vanity, part waste sexual emotion, part waste curiosity, it only mocks me. I have some hope of this puma. I have worked hard at her head and brain. And now, said he, standing up after a long gap of silence, during which we had each pursued our own thoughts. What do you think? I went fear of me still. I looked at him and saw but a white-faced, white-haired man with calm eyes, save for his serenity the touch. Almost a beauty that resulted from his set. Tranquility and his magnificent build. He might have passed master among 100 other comfortable old gentlemen. Then I shivered, but we've answered his second question. I handed him a revolver with either hand. Keep them, he said, and snatched as he yawned. He stood up, stared at me for a moment and smiled. You've had 2 eventful days, said he. I should have by some sleep. I'm glad it's all clear. Good night. He thought me over for a moment, then went out by the inner door. I immediately turned the key in the outer one. I sat down again, sat for a time in a kind of stagnant mood. So weary emotionally, mentally, and physically that I could not think beyond the point of which he'd left me. The black window stared at me like an eye, at last with an effort. I put out the light and got into the hammock. Very soon I was asleep. Chapter 15 concerning the beast folk. I woke early. Moreau's explanation stood before my mind, clear and definite from the moment of my awakening. I got out of the hammock and went to the door, to assure myself that the key was turned. Then I tried the window bar and found it firmly fixed that these man-like creatures were, in truth, only bestial monsters. Mere grotesque travesties of men filled me with a vague uncertainty of their possibilities, which was far worse than any definite fear. A tapping came at the door, and I heard the glutinous accents of Milling speaking. I pocketed one of the revolvers, keeping one hand upon it, and opened it to him. "Good morning, sire," he said, bringing in addition to the customary herb breakfast, an ill-cooked rabbit. Montgomery followed him. His roving eye caught the position of my arm, and he smiled. Askew the puma was resting to heal that day, but Moreau, who was singularly solitary in his habits, did not join us. I talked with Montgomery to clear my ideas of the way in which the beast folk lived. In particular, I was urgent to know how these inhuman monsters were kept from falling upon Moreau and Montgomery and from rending one another. He explained to me that the comparative safety of Maroon himself was due to the limited mental scope of these monsters. In spite of their increased intelligence and the tendency of their animal instincts to reawaken, they had certain fixed ideas implanted by Moreau in their minds, which absolutely bounded their imaginations. They were really hypnotized, had been told that certain things were impossible and that certain things were not to be done. And these prohibitions were woven into the texture of their minds, beyond any possibility of disobedience or dispute. Certain matters, however, in which old instinct was at war with Moreau's convenience, were in a less stable condition. A series of propositions called the law, I'd already heard them recited, battled in their minds with the deep-seated, ever-rebellious cravings of their animal natures. This law they were ever repeating, I found, and ever breaking. Both Montgomery and Moreau displayed particular solicitude to keep them ignorant of the taste of blood. They feared the inevitable suggestions of that flavor. Montgomery told me that the law, especially among the feline beast people, became oddly weakened about nightfall, but then the animal was at its strongest. That a spirit of adventure sprang up in them at the dusk, when they would dare things they never seemed to dream about by day. To that I owe my stalking by the leopard man on the night of my arrival, but during these earlier days of my stay, they broke the law only furtively, and after dark in the daylight was a general atmosphere of respect for its multifarious prohibitions. And here perhaps I may give a few general facts about the island and the beast people. The island, which was of irregular outline and lay low upon the wide sea, had a total area, I suppose, of 7 or 8 square miles. It was volcanic in origin, and was now fringed on 3 sides by coral reefs. Some fumaroles to the northward, and a hot spring were the only vestiges of the forces that had long since originated it. Now and then, a faint quiver of earthquake would be sensible, and sometimes the ascent of the spire of smoke will be rendered tumultuous by gusts of steam, but that was all. The population of the island, Montgomery informed me, now numbered rather more than 60 of these strange creations of Moreau's art, not counting the smaller monstrosities which lived in the undergrowth and were without human form. Altogether he had made nearly 120, but many had died, and others, like the rising footless thing, of which he had told me, had come by violent ends. In answer to my question, Montgomery said that they actually bore offspring, but that these generally died when they lived. Moreau took them and stamped the human form upon them. There was no evidence of the inheritance of their acquired human characteristics. The females were less numerous than the males, liable to much further persecution, in spite of the monogamy the law enjoined. It would be impossible for me to describe these beast people in detail. My eye has had no training in details, and unhappily I cannot sketch. Most striking, perhaps, in that general appearance, was the disproportion between the legs of these creatures and the length of their bodies, and yet so relative is our idea of grace, my eye became habituated to their forms. and at last I even fell in with their persuasion that my own long thighs were ungainly. Another point was the forward carriage of the head, and the clumsy and inhuman curvature of the spine. Even the ape man lacked that inward, sinuous curve of the back, which makes the human figure so graceful. Most had their shoulders hunched clumsily, and their short forearms hung weakly at their sides. Few of them were conspicuously hairy, at least until the end of my time upon the island. The next most obvious deformity was in their visages, almost all of which were prognathos, malformed about the ears, with large and protuberant noses, very furry or very bristly hair, and often strangely colored or strangely placed eyes. None could laugh, though the ape man had a chattering titter. Beyond these general characters, their heads had little in common. Each preserved the quality of its particular species. The human mark distorted, but did not hide the leopard, the ox or the sow or other animals from which the creature had been molded. Their voices too varied exceedingly. The hands were always malformed, and those. Some surprised me by their unexpected human appearance. Almost all were deficient in the number of digits, clumsy about the fingernails, and lacking any tactile sensibility. The two most formidable animal men were my leopard man, and a creature made of hyena and swine, larger than these, were the three bull creatures who pulled in the boat. Then came the silvery hairy man, who was also the sayer of the lomling, and a sat-like creature of ape and goat. There were 3 swine men and a swine woman, a mare rhinoceros creature, and several other females, whose sources I did not ascertain. There were several Wolf creatures, a bear bull, and a Saint Bernard man. I have already described the ape man, and there was a particularly hateful and evil-smelling old woman, made of vixen and bear, whom I hated from the beginning. She was said to be a passionate votary of the law. Smaller creatures were certain dappled youths and my little sloth creature. But enough of this catalogue. At first I had a shivering horror of the brutes, felt all too keenly that they were still brutes, but insensibly I became a little habituated to the idea of them, and moreover, I was affected by Montgomery's attitude towards them. He had been with them so long that he had come to regard them as almost normal human beings. His London days seemed a glorious, impossible past to him. Only once in a year or so did he go to Arica to deal with Morrow's agent, a trader in animals there. He hardly met the finest type of mankind. In that seafaring village of Spanish mongrels, the man aboard ship, he told me, seemed at first just as strange to him as the beastman seemed to me, unnaturally long in the leg, flat in the face, prominent in the forehead, suspicious, dangerous, and cold-hearted. In fact, he did not like men. His heart had warmed to me. He thought because he had saved my life, I fancied even then that he had a sneaking kindness for some of these metamorphosed brute, a vicious sympathy with some of their ways, but that he attempted to veil it from me at first. Mailing the blackface man, Montgomery's attendant, the first of the Peace folk I encountered, did not live with the others across the island, but in a small kennel at the back of the enclosure. The creature was scarcely so intelligent as the ape man, but far more docile and the most human-looking of all the beast folk, and Montgomery had trained it to prepare food, and indeed to discharge all the trivial domestic officers that were required. It was a complex trophy of Morrow's horrible skill, a bear tainted with dog and ox, and one of most elaborately made of all his creatures. He treated Montgomery with a strange tenderness and devotion. Sometimes he would notice it, pat it, call it half mocking, half jocular names, and so make a caper with extraordinary delight. Sometimes you will ill-treat it, especially after he had been at the whiskey, kicking it, beating it, pelting it with stones or lighted fuses. But whether he treated it well or ill, it loved nothing so much as to be near him. I say I became habituated to the beast people, that 1,000 things which had seemed unnatural and repulsive speedily became natural and ordinary to me. I suppose everything in existence takes its color from the average hue of our surroundings. Montgomery and Morrow were too peculiar and individual to keep my general impressions of humanity well defined. I would see one of the clumsy bovine creatures work the launch, treading heavily through the undergrowth, and find myself trying hard to recall how he differed from some really human yokel trudging home from his mechanical labors. Or I would meet the fox bear woman's vulpine, shifty face strangely human in its speculative cunning, and even imagine I'd met it before in some city byway. Yet every now and then, the beast would flash out upon me, beyond doubt or denial. An ugly-looking man, a hunchback human, savage to all appearance, squatting in the aperture of one of the dens, would stretch his arms and yawn, showing with startling suddenness scissor-edged incisors and saber-like canines, keen and brilliant as knives. Or in some narrow pathway, glancing with a transitory daring into the eyes of some live, white-wave female figure, I would suddenly see with a spasmodic revulsion that she had slit-like pupils. Or glancing down, note the curving nail with which she held her shapeless wrap about her. It is a curious thing, by the by, for which I'm quite unable to account, that these weird creatures, the females I mean, had in the earlier days of my stay an instinctive sense of their own repulsive clumsiness, and displayed in consequence a more than human regard for the decency and decorum of extensive costume. Chapter 16, How the Beast Folk Taste Blood. My inexperience as a writer betrays me, and I wonder from the thread of my story. After I had breakfast live with Montgomery, he took me across the island to see the funeral and the source of the hot spring into whose scalding waters I had blundered on the previous day. Both of us carried whips and load of revolvers while going through a leafy jungle. On our road with her, we heard a rabbit squealing. We stopped and listened, but we heard no more, and presently we went on our way, and the incident dropped out of our minds. Montgomery called my attention to certain little pink animals with long hind legs that went leaping through the undergrowth. He told me there were creatures made of the offspring of the beast, people that Burrow had invented. He had fancied that might serve for mate, but a rabbit-like habit of devouring their young had defeated this intention. I had already encountered some of these creatures, once during my moonlight flight from the leopard man, and once during my pursuit by Morrow on the previous day. By chance, one hopping to avoid us leapt into the hole, caused by the uprooting of a wind-blown tree. Before it could extricate itself, we managed to catch it. It spat like a cat, scratched and kicked vigorously with its hind legs, and made an attempt to bite, but its teeth were too feeble to inflict more than a painless pinch. It seemed to me rather a pretty little creature, and as Montgomery stated, that it never destroyed the turf by burrowing, and was very cleanly in the tabbets. I should imagine it might prove a convenient substitute for the common rabbit in gentlemen's parks. We also saw on our way the trunk of a tree, barked in long strips and splintered deeply. Montgomery called my attention to this. Not to claw the bark of trees, that is law, he said. Much some of them care for it. It was after this, I think, that we met the satyr in the ape man. The satyr was a gleam of classical memory on the part of Morrow, his face ovine and expression like the Xhosa Hebrew type, his voice a harsh bleat, his nether extremities satanic. He was gnawing the husk of a pod-like fruit. As he passed us, both of them saluted Montgomery. "Hail," said they to the other with the whip. "There's a third for the whip now," said Montgomery, "so you better mind." "What's he not made?" said the ape man. He said it was made." The Saturn man looked curiously at me. "The third with the whip either walks weeping into the sea, has a thin white face. He has a thin long whip," said Montgomery. "Yesterday he bled and wept." Said the satyr, "You never bleed no weep. The master does not bleed or weep on the dwarfy and beggar." Said Montgomery, "You're being weep if you don't look out." He has 5 fingers, he's 5 man. Like me, said the 8 man come along Prindick. Said Montgomery, taking my arm, and I went on with him. The Saturn and the 8 man stood watching us, making other remarks to each other. He says nothing, so the Satya men have voices. Yesterday he asked me of things to eat. So the 8 man he did not know. Then they spoke in audible things. And I heard the satyr laughing. It was on our way back that we came upon the dead rabbit. The red body of the wretched little beast was rent to pieces, many of the ribs stripped white, and the backbone indisputably gnawed. At that Montgomery stopped. Good God, said he, stooping down and picking up some of the crossed vertebrae to examine them more closely. Good God, he repeated. What can this mean? Some carnivore of yours has remembered its old habits. I said after a pause, this backbone has been bitten through. He stood staring with his face white, and his lip pulled askew. I don't like this, he said. Slowly I saw something of the same kind. Said I, the first day I came here, whatever you did, what was it? A rabbit with its head twisted off. The day you came here. The day I came here in the undergrowth of the back of the enclosure, when I went out in the evening. The head was completely wrung off. He gave a long, low whistle, and what is more, I have an idea which of your brooks did the thing. It's only a suspicion, you know. Before I came on the rabbit, I saw one of your monsters drinking in the stream. Sucking his drink, yes, not to suck your drink, that's the law. Much the boots care for the law, eh? When Moreau's not about, it was the brute who chased me. Of course, said Montgomery, it's just the way we can afford after a kill to drink. It's a taste of blood, you know. What was the brute like? He continued, would you know him again? He glanced about us, standing astride of the mess of dead rabbit, his eyes roving among the shadows and screens of greenery, the lurking places and ambuscades of the forest that bounded us. In the taste of blood, he said again. He took out his revolver, examined the cartridges in it, and replaced it. Then he began to pull at his dropping lip. I think I should know the brute again. I said I stunned him. He ought to have a handsome bruise on the forehead of him, but then we have to prove that he killed the rabbit. Is it Montgomery? I wish I'd never brought the things here. I should have gone on, but he stayed there, thinking over the mangled rabbit. In a puzzle-headed way as it was, I went to such a distance that the rabbit's remains were hidden. Come on, I said. Presently he woke up and came towards me. You see, he said, almost in the whisper, they are all supposed to have a fixed idea against eating anything that runs on land. If some protest by any accident tasted blood. We went on somewhere in silence. I wonder what could have happened. He said to himself then, after pause again, I did a foolish thing the other day, that server divine. I showed him how to skin and cook a rabbit. Sorry, I saw him licking his hands. It never occurred to me then we must put a stop to this. I must tell Barrow. He could think of nothing else. On our homeward journey, Barrow took the matter even more seriously than Montgomery, and I need scarce to say that I was affected by their evident consternation. We must make an example, Samaro. I've no doubt my own mind that the leopard man was a sinner, but how can we prove it? I wish, Montgomery, you had kept your taste from beaten hand gone. Without these exciting novelties, we may find ourselves in a mess. Yet through it I was a silly ass to Montgomery, but the thing's done now, and you said I might have them. You know we must see the thing at once tomorrow. I suppose if anything should turn up, Mling can take care of himself. I'm not so sure of Mling to Montgomery. I think I ought to know him. In the afternoon morrow, Montgomery, myself, and Mei-Ling went across the island of the huts. In the ravine we 3 were armed. Mei-Ling carried the little hatchet he used in chopping firewood, and some coils of wire. Morrow had a huge cowherd's horn slung over his shoulder. You will see a gathering of the beast people, said Montgomery. It's a pretty sight. Burroughs said not a word on the way, but the expression of his heavy, white fringed face was grimly said. we crossed the ravine, down which smoked the stream of hot water, and followed the winding pathway through the cane brakes until we reached a wide area covered over with a thick, powdery yellow substance which I believe was sulfur. Above the shoulder of a weedy bank, the sea glittered. We came to a kind of shallow natural amphitheater, and here, the four of us halted the morrow sound of the horn and broke the sleeping stillness of the tropical afternoon. He must have had strong lungs. The hooting note rose and rose amidst his echoes too. At last an ear-penetrating intensity. "Ah," said Morau, letting the curved instrument fall to his side again. Immediately, there was a crashing through the yellow canes and a sound of voices from the dense, green jungle that marked the moras, through which I'd run on the previous day. Then at 3 or 4 points, on the edge of the sulphurous area, appeared the grotesque forms of the beast, people hurrying towards us. I could not help but creeping horror, as I perceived first one, and then another trot out from the trees or reeds, and come shambling along over the hot dust. But Moreau and Montgomery stood calmly enough, and before I stuck beside them. First to arrive was the satyr, strangely unreal for all the T-cars to shadow, and tossed the dust with his hoofs. After him from the brake came a monstrous loud, a thing of horse and rhinoceros, chewing a straw as it came. Then appeared the swine woman and the wolf women. Then the fox bear witch with her red eyes and her peaked red face, and then others all hurrying equally. As they came forward, they began to cringe towards Moreau and chant, quite regardless of one another, fragments of the latter half of the litany of the law. His is the hand that wounds, his is the hand that heals, and so forth. As soon as they had approached, within the distance of perhaps 30 yards, they halted and, bowing on knees and elbows, began flinging the white dust upon their heads. Imagine the scene if you can. We 3 blue cloud men, with our misshapen black-faced attendant, standing in a wide expanse of sunlit yellow dust, under a blazing blue sky, and surrounded by the circle of crouching and gesticulating monstrosities, some almost human, saving their subtle expression and gestures, some like cripples, some so strangely distorted, as resemble nothing but the denizens of our wildest dreams. And beyond, the reedy lines of a cane brake in one direction, a dense tangle of palm trees on the other, separating us from the ravine with the huts, and to the north the hazy horizon of the Pacific Ocean, 60 to 63. Count tomorrow, there are 4 more. I do not see the leopard man, said I presently. Morrow sounded the great horn again, and at the sound of it all, the beast people riots and groveled in the dust. Then slinking out of the cane brake, stooping in the ground, and trying to join the dust-throwing circle, behind Morrow's back came the leopard man. The last of the beast people to arrive was the little ape man. The earlier animals, hot and weary with their groveling, shot vicious glances at him. "See," said Morrow in his firm, loud voice, and the beast people sat back upon their hands and rested from their worshipping. "Where's the sayer of the law?" said Morrow, and the hairy gray monster bowed his face in the dust. "Say the words." Tomorrow forthwith all in the kneeling assembly, swaying from side to side and dashing up the sulfur with their hands. First the right hand and a puff of dust, and then the left began once more to chant, their strange listening. When they reached not to eat flesh or fish, that is the law. Burrow held up his lank white hand. "Stop," he cried, and there fell absolute silence upon them all. I think they all knew and dreaded what was coming. I looked around at their strange visages. When I saw their wincing attitudes and the 30 dread in their luminous gaze, I wondered that I'd ever believed them to be men. That law has been broken, Zemuro, none escape. From the faceless creature with the silvery hair, none escape. Repeat of the kneeling circle of beast people. Who is he? Cry Morrow. I looked around at their visages. Cracking his whip, I fancied the hyena swine looked dejected, so too did the leopard man. Morrow stopped facing this creature, who cringed towards him. with the memory and dread of infinite torment. "Who is he?" repeated Moreau in a voice of thunder. "Evil is he who breaks the law," chanted the Ser of the law. Burrow looked into the eyes of the leopard man and seemed to be dragging the very soul out of the creature who breaks the law, Samaro, taking his eyes off his victim and turning towards us. Seemed to me there was a touch of exaltation in his voice. "Goes back to the house of pain," they all clamored. "Goes back to the house of pain, or master. Back to the house of pain. Back to the house of pain," gabbled the ape man as though the idea was sweet to him. "Do you hear tomorrow turning back to the criminal? My friend, hello," for the leopard man, released from Moreau's eye, had risen straight from his knees, and now with eyes of flame, and his huge feline tusks flashing out from under his curling lips, leapt towards his tormentor. I'm convinced that only the madness of unanswerable fear could have prompted this attack. The whole circle of free school monsters seemed to rise about us. I drew my revolver. The two figures collided. I saw Morrow reeling back from the leopard man's blow. There was a furious yelling and howling all about us. Everyone was moving rapidly. For a moment I thought it was a general revolt. The furious face of the leopard band flashed by mine, with Mailing close in pursuit. I saw the yellow eyes of the hyena swine blazing with excitement. His attitude as if he were half resolved to attack me. The satyr, too, glared at me over the hyena swine's hunched shoulders. I heard the crack at Morrow's pistol and saw the pink flash dart across the tumult. The whole crowd seemed to swing round in the direction of the glint of fire, and I too was swung round by the magnetism of the movement. In another second I was running, one of the tumultuous shouting crowd, in pursuit of the escaping leopard man. That is all I can tell definitely. I saw the leopard man strike Morrow, and then everything spun about me until I was running headlong. Mailing was ahead, close in pursuit of the fugitive. Behind, their tongues already longing, outrun the Wolf women in great leaping strides. The swine folk followed, squealing with excitement, and the two bullmen in their swathings of white. Then came a row in a cluster of the beast people. His wide-brimmed straw hat blown off, his revolver in hand, and his lank white hair streaming out. The heinous swine ran beside me, keeping pace with me, and glancing furtively at me out of his feline eyes. And the others came pattering and shouting behind us. The leopard man went busting his way through the long canes, which sprang back as he passed and raffled him Ling's face. We others in the rear found a trampled path for us. When we reached the break, the chase lay through the break, perhaps a quarter of a mile, and then plunged into a dense thicket, which retarded our movement, succeedingly, that we went through it in the crowd together, fronds flicking into our visages, ropey creepers catching us under the chin or gripping our ankles, thorny plants hooking into and tearing cloth and flesh. Together, he has gone on all fours through this panda morale. Now just ahead of me, not escape so, the Wolf bear, laughing into my face with the exaltation of hunting. We burst out again among rocks and saw the quarry ahead, running lightly on all fours and snarling at us. Over his shoulder, at that the Wolf folk howled with delight. The thing was still closed, and at a distance its face still seemed human, but the carriage of its forelimbs was feline, and the furtive droop of its shoulder was distinctly that of a hunted animal. It leapt over some thorny, yellow flowering bushes and was hidden. Mailing was halfway across the space. Most of us now had lost the first speed of the chase and have fallen into a longer and steadier stride. I saw as we traversed the open that the pursuit was now spreading from a column into a line. The hyena's whine still ran close to me, watching me as it ran every now and then, puckering its muzzle with a snarling laugh. At the edge of the rocks, the leopard man, realizing that he was making for the projecting cape, upon which he had stalked me on the night of my arrival, had doubled in the undergrove. The Montgomery had seen the maneuver and turned him again, so panting tumbling against rocks torn by rambles, impeded by ferns and reeds. I helped pursue the leopard man who had broken the law, and the hyena swine ran laughing savagely by my side. I staggered on my head, reeling in my heart beating against my ribs, tired almost to death, and yet not daring to lose sight of the chase. That I should be left alone with this horrible companion. I staggered on in spite of infinite fatigue and the dense heat of the tropical afternoon. At last the fury of the hunt slackened. We had pinned the wretched brute into a corner of the island. Morrow, whip in hand, marshaled us all into an irregular line, and we advanced now slowly, shouting to one another as we advanced, and tightening the cordon about our victim. He lurked noiseless and invisible in the bush through which I had run from him. During that midnight pursuit, Steady grab a row, steady at the end of the line, crept around the tangle of undergrowth and hemmed the brute in. Beware of a rush. Came the voice of Montgomery from beyond the thicket. I was on the slope above the bushes. Montgomery and Morrow beat along the beach beneath. Slowly we pushed in, among the fretted network of branches and leaves. The quarry was silent. Back to the house of Paid. The house of Paid, the house of Paid. Yep, the voice of the ape man some 20 yards to the right. When I heard that, I forgave the poor wretch all the fear he had inspired in me. I heard the twigs snap and the boughs swish aside before the heavy tread of the horse. Rhinoceros upon my right, then suddenly, through a polygon of green, in the half-darkness under the luxuriant growth, I saw the creature we were hunting. I halted. He was crouched together. Into the smallest possible compass, his luminous green eyes turned over his shoulder regarding me. It may seem a strange contradiction in me. I cannot explain the fact. But now seeing the creature there, in a perfectly animal attitude, with the light gleaming in its eyes and its imperfectly human face distorted with terror, I realized again the fact of its humanity. In another moment other of its pursuers would see it, and it would be overpowered and captured, to experience once more the horrible tortures of the enclosure. Abruptly I slipped out my revolver, aimed between its terror-struck eyes and fired. As I did so, the hyena's whine saw the thing and flung itself upon it with an eager cry, thrusting thirsty teeth into his neck. All about me, the green masses of the thicket were swaying and cracking. The beast people came rushing together. One face and then another appeared. "Don't kill it, Brennick," cried Morrow, "don't kill it." And I saw him stooping as he pushed through, under the fronds of the big ferns. In another moment he had beaten off the hyena's swine with the handle of his whip. And here Montgomery were keeping away the excited, carnivorous beast people, and particularly Mling from the still quivering body. The hairy, gray thing came sniffing at the corpse under my arm. The other animals in the animal order jostled me to get a nearer view. "Confound you, Pendic Samoro. I wanted him. I'm sorry, should I, though I was not. It was the impulse of the moment. I felt sick with exertion and excitement. Turning, I pushed my way out of the crowding beast people and went on lone up the slope towards the higher part of the headland. Under the shouted directions of Morrow, I heard the three white suede bull men begin dragging the victim down towards the water. It was easy now for me to be alone. The beast people manifested a quite human curiosity about the dead body and followed it in a thick knot, sniffing and growling at it as the bull men dragged it down the beach. I went to the headland and watched the ball men, black against the evening sky, as they carried the weight of dead body out to sea. And like a wave across my mind came the realization of the unspeakable aimlessness of things upon the island, upon the beach. Among the rocks beneath me were the ape man, the hyena swine, and several other of the beast people, standing about Montgomery Morrow. They were all still intensely excited, and all overflowing with noisy expressions of their loyalty to the law. Yet I felt an absolute assurance in my own mind that the hyena's whine was implicated in the rabbit killing. A strange persuasion came upon me that, save for the grossness of the line, the grotesqueness of the forms I had here before me, the whole balance of human life in miniature, the whole interplay of instinct, reason, and fate in its simplest form, the leopard man had happened to go under. That was all the difference. Paul Brute, I began to see the viola aspect of Morrow's cruelty. I've not thought before of the pain and trouble that came to these poor victims. After their pass from Morrow's hands, I'd shiver only at the days of actual torment in the enclosure. But now that seemed to me the lesser part, before there had been beasts, the instincts fitly adapted to their surroundings, and happy as living things may be. Now they stumbled in the shackles of humanity, lived in a fear that never died. Threatened by a law they could not understand, they mock human existence. Begun in an agony was one long internal struggle, one long dread of Morrow, and for what? It was the wantedness of it that stirred me. Had Morrow had any intelligible object I could have sympathized at least a little with him, I'm not so squeamish about pain as that. I could have forgiven him a little, even had his motive been only hate, but he was so irresponsible, so utterly careless, his curiosity his mad, aimless investigations drove him on, and the things were thrown out to live a year or so, to struggle and blunder and suffer, and at last to die painfully. They were wretched in themselves. The old animal hate moved them to trouble one another. The law held them back from a brief, hot struggle and decisive end to their natural animosities. In those days my fear of the beast people went the way of my personal fear for Morrow. I fell indeed into a morbid state, deep and enduring an alien to fear, which has left permanent scars on my mind. I must confess that I lost faith in the sanity of the world when I saw it suffering. The painful disorder of this island, a blind fate, a vast, pitiless mechanism, seemed to cut and shape the fabric of existence. And I Morrow by his passion for research, Montgomery by his passion for drink, the beast people, with their instincts and mental restrictions, were torn and crushed ruthlessly, inevitably, amid the infinite complexity of its incessant wheels. But this condition did not come all at once. I think indeed that I anticipate a little in speaking of it now. Chapter 17a. Catastrophe. Scarcely 6 weeks passed before I had lost every feeling but dislike and abhorrence for this infamous experiment of Morrow's. My one idea was to get away from these horrible caricatures of my Maker's image, back to the sweet and wholesome intercourse of men. My fellow creatures from whom I was thus separated began to assume idyllic virtue and beauty in my memory. My first friendship with Montgomery did not increase. His long separation from humanity, his secret vice of drunkenness, his evident sympathy with the beast people, tainted him to me. Several times I let him go alone. Among them I avoided intercourse with them in every possible way. I spent an increasing proportion of my time upon the beach, looking for some liberating sail that never appeared, until one day they fell upon us in appalling disaster, which put an altogether different aspect upon my strange surroundings. It was about 7 or 8 weeks after my landing, rather more I think, though I don't trouble to keep account of the time, when this catastrophe occurred. It happened in the early morning, I should think about 6. I had risen and breakfasted early, having been aroused by the noise of 3 beast men carrying wood into the enclosure. After breakfast, I went to the open gateway of the enclosure and stood there smoking a cigarette and enjoying the freshness of the early morning. Morrow presently came around the corner of the enclosure and greeted me. He passed by me, and I heard him behind me unlock and had his laboratory, so indurator was I at that time, to the abomination of the place, that I heard without a touch of emotion the puma victim begin another day of torture. It met its persecutor with a shriek, almost exactly like that of an angry virago. Then, suddenly something happened. I do not know what to this day. I heard a short, sharp cry behind me, a fall and turning, saw an awful face rushing upon me. Not human, not animal, but hellish brown seen with red branching scars. Red drops starting out upon it, and the lidless eyes ablaze. I threw up my arm to defend myself from the blow. That flung me headlong with a broken forearm, and the great monster swayed and lint with red stain, bandages. Fluttering about, it leapt over me and passed. I rolled over and over down the beach, tried to sit up and collapsed upon my broken arm. Then Morrow appeared, his massive, white face all the more terrible, for the blood that trickled from his forehead. He carried a revolver in one hand. He scarcely glanced at me, but rushed off at once in pursuit of the puma. I tried the other arm and sat up. The muffled figure in front ran in great, striding leaps. Along the beach, a Morrow followed her. She turned her head and saw him. Then doubling abruptly made for the bushes. She gained upon him at every stride. I saw her plunge into them. A Morrow running slantingly to intercept her. Fired and missed, she disappeared. Then he vanished. In the green confusion, I stared after them. And then the pain in my arm flamed up, and with a groan I staggered my feet. Montgomery appeared in the doorway, dressed and with his revolver in hand. "Great guard Prendick," he said. Not noticing that I was hurt, that Bruce loose tore the fetcher out of the wall. "Have you seen them?" Then sharply seeing I gripped my arm. "What's the matter?" I was standing in the doorway. Said I. He came forward and took my arm. "Blood on the sleeve," said he, and rolled back the flannel. He pocketed his weapon, felt my arm about painfully, and led me inside. "Your arm's broken," he said. And then, "Tell me exactly how it happened. What happened?" I told him what I'd seen, told him in broken sentences, with gasps of pain between them, and very dexterously and swiftly. He bound my arm meanwhile. He slung it from my shoulder, stood back and looked at me. "You'll do," he said, and now he thought that. He went out and locked the gates of the enclosure. He was absent some time. I was chiefly concerned about my arm. The incident seems merely one more of many horrible things. I sat down in the deck chair, and I must admit, swore heartily at the island. The first dull feeling of injury in my arm had already given way to a burning pain. When Montgomery reappeared, his face was rather pale, and he showed more of his lower gums than ever. I can neither see nor hear anything of him. He said, "I've been thinking you may want my help." He stared at me with his expressionless eyes. "That was a strong brute," he said. His sibling wrenched his featured out of the wall, went to the window, then to the door, and there turned to me. I should go after him. He said, "There's another revolver I can leave with you. To tell you the truth, I feel anxious somehow." He obtained the weapon and put it ready to my hand on the table, then went out, leaving a restless contagion in the air. I did not sit long after he left, but took the revolver in hand and went to the doorway. The morning was as still as death. Not a whisper of wind was stirring. The sea was like polished glass. The sky empty, the beach desolate. In my half-excited, half-fever state, the stillness of things oppressed me. I tried to whistle, and the tune died away. I swore again the second time that morning. Then I went to the corner of the enclosure and stared inland at the green bush that had swallowed up Morrow in Montgomery. When would they return, and how? Then far away up the beach, a little gray beast man appeared, ran down to the water's edge and began splashing about. I strolled back to the doorway, then to the corner again, and so began pacing to and fro, like a sentinel upon duty. Once I was arrested by the distant voice of Montgomery, bawling "Cooey Morrow." My arm became less painful but very hot. I got feverish and thirsty. My shadow grew shorter. I watched the distant figure until it went away again. Would maroon Montgomery never return? 3 seabirds began fighting for some stranded treasure. Then from far away behind the enclosure, I heard a pistol shot. A long silence, and then came another, then a yelling cry nearer, and another dismal gap of silence. My unfortunate imagination set to work to torment me. Then suddenly a shot close by. I went to the corner startled and saw Montgomery, his face scarlet, his hair disordered and the knee of his trousers torn. His face expressed profound consternation. Behind him slouched the beast man, mailing and round Bling's jaws with some queer, dark stains. "Has he come?" said Montgomery. Morrow said, "I know, my God." The man was panting, almost sobbing. "Go back in," he said, taking my arm. "They're mad. They're all rushing about mad. What could have happened? I don't know. I'll tell you when my breath comes. Where's the brandy?" Montgomery limped before me into the room and sat down in the deck chair. Mailing flung himself down just outside the doorway and began padding like a dog. I got Montgomery some brandy and water. He sat staring in front of him at nothing. Recovering his breath after some minutes, he began to tell me what had happened. He had followed their track for some way. It was plain enough at first. On account of the crushed and broken bushes, white rags torn from the pumas, bandages and occasional smears of blood on the leaves of the shrubs and undergrowth. He lost the track, however, on the stony ground beyond the stream, where I had seen the beast man drinking, and went wandering aimlessly westward, shouting Morrow's name. Then Mailing had come to him carrying a light hatchet. Mailing had seen nothing of the puma fair, had been felling wood and heard him calling. They went on shouting. Together, two beast men came, crouching and peering at them through the undergrowth, with gestures and a furtive carriage that alarmed Montgomery by their strangeness. He hailed them and they fled guiltily. He stopped shouting after that, and after wondering some time, farther in an undecided way, determined to visit the huts. He found the ravine deserted, growing more alarmed every minute. He began to retrace his steps. Then it was he encountered the two swine men I had seen dancing on the night of my arrival, blood-stained. They were about the mouth and intensely excited. They came crashing through the ferns and stopped with fierce visages when they saw him. He cracked his whip in some trepidation, and forthwith they rushed at him. Never before had a beast man dared to do that. One he shot through the head. Mling flung himself upon the other, and the two rolled grappling. Mling got his brute under, and with his teeth in its throat. Montgomery shot that too, as it struggled in Ming's grip. He had some difficulty in inducing Bling to come on with him, then hurried back to me. On the way, Bling had suddenly rushed into a thicket and driven out an undersized Aslop man, also blood-stained, and laying through a wound in the foot. This brute had run a little way and then turned savagely at bay. A Montgomery, with a certain wantedness, I thought had shot him. "What does it all mean?" said I. He shook his head and turned once more to the brandy. Chapter 18: The Finding of Morrow. When I saw Montgomery swallow a third dose of brandy, I took it upon myself to interfere. He was already more than half puddled. I told him that some serious thing must have happened to Morrow. By this time what? He would have returned before this, and it behoved us to ascertain what that catastrophe was. Montgomery raised some feeble objections, and at last agreed. We had some food, and then all three of us started. It is possibly due to the tension of my mind at the time, but even now, that start into the hot stillness of the tropical afternoon is a singularly vivid impression. Bling went first, his shoulder hunched, his strange black head moving with quick starts, as he appeared first on this side of the way, and then on that he was unarmed. His axe he had dropped when he encountered the swine man. Teeth were his weapons when it came to fighting. Montgomery followed with stumbling footsteps, his hands in his pockets, his face downcast. He was in a state of muddled sulliness with me on account of the brandy. My left arm was in a sling, and was lucky was my left, and I carried my revolver in my right. Soon we traced a narrow path through the wild Luxor into the island going northwestward, and presently Mailing stopped and became rigid with botchfulness. Montgomery almost staggered into him and then stopped, too, then listening intently. We heard coming through the trees the sound of voices and footsteps approaching us. Is dead to the deep vibrating voice. He's not dead, he's not dead. Jab another, we saw, said several voices. Hello, suddenly shot of Montgomery. Hello there, confound you, said I and gripped my pistol. There was a silence, then a crashing among the interlacing vegetation. First here, then there, and then half a dozen visages appeared. Strange visages lit by a strange light bling. Made a growling noise in his throat. I recognized the ape-man. I had indeed already identified his voice. And two of the white suede, brown, featured creatures I'd seen Montgomery's boat with. These were the two dappled brutes, and that gray, horribly crooked creature who said the law, with gray hair streaming down its cheeks. Heavy gray eyebrows and gray locks, pouring off from a central parting, upon its sloping forehead. A heavy faceless thing with strange red eyes, looking at it curiously from amidst the green. For a space no one spoke. Then Montgomery hiccuped, who said he was dead. The monkey man looked guilty at the hairy gray thing. He is dead, said this monster they saw. There was nothing threatening about this detachment. At any rate, they seemed all stricken and puzzled. Where is he? Said Montgomery beyond. And the great creature pointed. Is there a law now? Ask the monkey man, is it still to be this and that? Is it indeed? Is there a law? Repeated the man in white. Is there a law that was so with the whip? He is dead, said the hairy gray thing, and they all stood watching us. Prindick, said Montgomery, turning his dull eyes to me. He's dead, evidently. I've been standing behind him during this colloquy. I began to see how things lay with them. I suddenly stepped in front of Montgomery, lifted up my voice. Children of the law, I said, he is not dead. Mling turned his sharp eyes on me. He has changed his shape, he has changed his body. I went on for a time, you will not see him. He is there. I pointed upward where he can watch you. You cannot see him, but he can see you. Fear the law. I looked at them squarely. They flinched. He is great, he is good, said the ape-man, peering fearfully upward among the dense trees. And the other thing, I demanded. The thing that bled and ran screaming and sobbing. That is dead too, so the gray thing still regarding me. Well, that's well granted, Montgomery. The other with the whip, began the gray thing. Well, should I said he was dead? The Montgomery was still sober enough to understand my motive in denying Morrow's death. He is not dead, he said slowly. Not dead at all, no more dead than I am. Some today have broken the law. They will die. Some have died. Show us now where his old body lies, the body he cast away because he had no more need of it. It is this way, man who walked in the sea, said the great thing. And with these 6 creatures guiding us, we went through the tumult of ferns and creepers and tree stems towards the northwest. Then came a yelling, a crashing among the branches, and a little pink homunculus rushed by us shrieking. Immediately after appeared a monster, in headlong pursuit, blood bedabbled, who was amongst us. Almost before he could stop his career, the gray thing left a sideling with a snarl, flew at it, and was struck aside. Montgomery fired and missed. Bowed his head, threw up his arm, and turned to run. I fired, and the thing still came on, fired again point blank into its ugly face. I saw its features vanish in the flash. Its face was driven in. Yet it passed me, gripped Montgomery, and holding him, fell headlong beside him, and pulled him sprawling upon itself. In its death agony, I found myself alone with Mailing, the dead brute, and the prostrate man. Montgomery raised himself slowly, and stared in a mottled way at the shattered beast. Man beside him, it more than half sobered him. He scrambled to his feet. Then I saw the grave thing, returning cautiously through the trees. See, said I, pointing to the dead brute. Is the law not alive? This came of breaking the law. He appeared at the body, he sends the fire that kills, said he in his deep voice, repeating part of the ritual. The others gathered round and stared for a space. At last, we drew near the westward extremity of the island. We came upon the gnawed and mutilated body of the puma, its shoulder bone smashed by a bullet perhaps 20 yards. Father found at last what we sought. Moreau lay face downward in a trampled space. In a cane break, one hand was almost severed at the wrist, and his silvery hair was dabbled in blood. His head had been battered in by the fetters of the puma. The broken canes beneath him was smeared with blood. His revolver we could not find. Montgomery turned him over, resting at intervals, and with the help of the 7 beast people. Where he was a heavy man, we carried Moreau back to the enclosure. The night was darkling twice. We heard unseen creatures howling and shrieking past our little band. And once the little pink sloth creature appeared and stared at us and vanished again. But we were not attacked again. At the gates of the enclosure, our company of beast people left us mailing. Going with the rest, we locked ourselves in and then took Monroe's mangled body into the yard and laid it upon a pile of brushwood. Then we went into the laboratory and put an end to all we found living there. Chapter 19, Montgomery's Bank Holiday. When this was accomplished and we had washed and eaten, Montgomery and I went into my little room and seriously discussed our position. For the first time, it was then near midnight. He was almost sober but greatly disturbed in his mind. He had been strangely under the influence of Morrow's personality. I do not think it had ever occurred to him that Morrow could die. This disaster was the sudden collapse of the habits that had become part of his nature in the more monotonous years he had spent on the island. He talked vaguely, answered my questions crookedly, wandered into general questions. This silly world, he said. What a model it all is. I haven't had any life. I wonder when it's going to begin. 16 years. Being bullied by nurses and schoolmasters at their own suite will 5 in London. Grinding hard at medicine. Bad food, shabby lodging. Shabby clothes, shabby vice. A blunder, I didn't know any better. And hustled off to this beastly island. 10 years here, what's it all for, Brendick? Are we bubbles blown by a baby? It was hard to deal with such ravings. The thing we have to think of now, said I, is how to get away from this island. What's the good of getting away? I'm an outcast whereby to join on. It's all very well for you, Prindick Promoro. We can't leave him here to have his bones picked, as it is, and besides, what will become of the decent part of the beast folk? Well, should I? That will do tomorrow. I've been thinking we might make the brushwood into a pyre and burn his body and those other things. Then what will happen with the beast folk? I don't know, I suppose. Those that were made of beasts of prey will make silly ashes themselves. Sooner or later we got massive of the lot, can we? I suppose that's what your humanity would suggest, but they'll change, they're sure to change. He talked thus inconclusively until last I felt my temper going. Damnation, he exclaimed at some petulance of mine. Can't you see I'm at a worse hole than you are? And he got up and went for the brandy drink, he said, returning you logic, chopping chalky face. Saint of an atheist, drink not, I said I, and sat grimily watching his face under the yellow paraffin flare as he drank himself into a garrulous misery. I have a memory of infinite tedium. He wandered into a Morton defense of the beast people and of mailing, he said, was the only thing that had ever really cared for him. And suddenly an idea came to him. I'm damned, said he, staggering to his feet and clutching the brandy bottle. By some flash of intuition, I knew what it was he intended. You don't give drink to that beast, I said, rising and facing him. Beast, said he. You're the beast. He takes his liquor like a Christian. Come out of the way, Prendick. For God's sake, should I get out of the way? He roared and suddenly whipped out his revolver. Very well, said I, and stood aside, half-minded to fall upon him as he put his hand upon the latch, but deterred by the thought of my useless arm. You've made a beast of yourself. To the beast you may go. He flung the doorway open and stood half facing me, between the yellow lamplight and the pallid glare of the moon. His eye sockets were blotches of black. Under his stubbly eyebrows, you're a solemn prick, Brendick. A silly ass you're always fearing of fancying. We're on the edge of things. I'm bound to cut my throat. Tomorrow, I'm gonna have a damn bank holiday tonight. He turned without into the moonlight bling. He cried, Ringo friend. 3 dim creatures in the silvery light came along the edge of the one beach, one a white-wrapped creature, the other 2 blotches of blackness following it. They halted staring, then I saw Mling's hunched shoulders. As he came around the corner of the house, Trick cried, Montgomery. Drink your brutes, drink could be men, tab. It on the clevers, but I forgot this. This is the last touch drink. I tell you, I'm waving the bottle in his hand. He started off at a kind of quick trot to the westward. Mailing ranged himself between him and the 3 dim creatures who followed. I went to the doorway. They were already indistinct. In the mist of the moonlight, before Montgomery halted, I saw him administer a dose of the raw brandy to Mailing and saw the 5 figures melt into one. Vague patch, sing, I heard Montgomery shout. Sing all together, confounder Predic. That's right, now again, confounder Predic. The black group broke up into 5 separate figures and wound slowly away from me. Along the band of shining beach, each went howling at his own sweet will, yelping insults at me or giving whatever other vent this new inspiration of brandy demanded. Presently heard Montgomery's voice shouting, right turn. They passed with their shouts and howls into the blackness of the landward trees. Slowly, very slowly, they receded into silence. The peaceful splendor of the night healed again. The moon was now past the meridian, and traveling down the west, it was at its full and very bright, riding through the empty blue sky. The shadow of the wall lay a yard wide, and of inky blackness at my feet. The eastward sea was a featureless gray, dark and mysterious, and between the sea and the shadow, the gray sands of volcanic glass and crystals flashed and shine like a beach of diamonds. Behind me the paraffin lamp flared hot and ruddy. Then I shut the door, locked it, and went into the enclosure, where Morrow lay beside his latest victims, the staghounds and the llama, and some other wretched brutes, with his massive face, calm even after his terrible death, with the hard eyes open, staring at the dead white moon above. I sat down upon the edge of the sink, with my eyes upon that ghastly pile of silvery light, and ominous shadows began to turn over my plans. In the morning, I would gather some provisions in the dinghy, and after setting fire to the pyre before me, push out into the desolation of the high sea once more. I felt that the Montgomery there was no help, that he was in truth half akin to these beast folk, unfitted for human kindred. I do not know how long I sat there scheming, must have been an hour or so. Then my planning was interrupted by the return of Montgomery to my neighborhood. I heard a yelling from many throats, a tumult of exultant cries passing down towards the beach, whooping and howling and excited shrieks that seemed to come to a stop near the water's edge. The riot rose and fell. I heard heavy blows and the splintering smash of wood, but it did not trouble me. Then a discordant chanting began. My thoughts went back to my means of escape. I got up, brought the lamp, and went into a shed to look at some kegs I had seen there. Then I became interested in the contents of some biscuit tins and opened one. I saw something out of the tail of my eye, a red figure, and turned sharply. Behind me lay the yard, vividly black and white in the moonlight, and a pile of wood and faggots on which maroon is mutilated. Victims lay, one over another. They seemed to be gripping one another in one last revengeful grapple. His wounds gaped black as night, and the blood that had dripped, laying black patches upon the sand. Then I saw, without understanding the cause of my phantom, a ruddy glow that came and danced and went upon the wall opposite. I misinterpreted this, fancied it was reflection of my flickering lamp, and turned again to the stores in the shed. I went on, rummaging among them as well as a one-armed man could, finding this convenient thing and that, and putting them aside for tomorrow's launch. My movements were slow and the time passed quickly. Insensibly the daylight crept upon me. The chanting died down, giving place to a clamor. Then it began again and suddenly broke into a tumult. I heard cries at more a sound like quarreling and a sudden wild shriek. The quality of the sounds changed so greatly that it arrested my attention. I went out into the yard and listened. Then, cutting like a knife across the confusion, came the crack of a revolver. I rushed once through my room to the little doorway. As I did so, I heard some of the packing cases behind me cause sliding down and smash together with a clatter of glass on the floor of the shed, but I did not heed these. I flung the door open and looked out, up the beach by the boathouse. A bonfire was burning, raining up sparks into the indistinctness of the dawn. Around this struggle the massive black figures. I heard Montgomery call my name. I began to run at once towards this fire, revolver in hand. I saw the pink tongue of Montgomery's pistol lick out. Once close to the ground he was down. I shouted with all my strength and fired into the air. I heard someone cry the master. The noted black struggle broke into scattering units. The fire leapt and sank down. The crowd of beast people fled. And sudden panic before me, up the beach in my excitement. I fired at their retreating backs as they disappeared among the bushes. Then I turned to the black heaps upon the ground. Montgomery lay on his back with the hairy, gray beast man sprawling across his body. The brute was dead, but still gripping Montgomery's throat with its curving claws nearby, lame ling on. His face and quite still, his neck bitten open, and the upper part of the smashed brandy bottle. In his hand, two other figures lay near the fire, the one motionless, the other groaning fitfully every now and then, raising its head slowly then dropping it again. I called hold of the gray man and pulled him off Montgomery's body. His claws drew down the torn coat reluctantly. As I dragged him away, Montgomery was dark in the face and scarcely breathing. I splashed seawater on his face and pillowed his head on my rolled-up coat. Mailing was dead, the wounded creature by the fire. It was a wolf brute with a bearded gray face. Lay I found, with a fur part of its body, upon the still glowing timber. The wretched thing was injured so dreadfully that in mercy I blew its brains out at once. The other brute was one of the ball men. Swathed in white, he too was dead. The rest of the beast people had vanished from the beach. I went to Montgomery again and knelt beside him, cursing my ignorance of medicine. The fire beside me had sunk down, and only charred beams of timber, glowing at the central ends, and mixed with the gray ash of brushwood remained. I wondered casually where Montgomery had got his wood. Then I saw that the dawn was upon us. The sky had grown brighter. The setting moon was becoming pale and opaque in the luminous blue of the day. The sky to the eastward was rimmed with red. Suddenly I heard a thud and hissing behind me, and looking around, sprang to my feet with a cry of horror. Against the warm dawn, great, tumultuous masses of black smoke were boiling up out of the enclosure, and through their stormy darkness shot flickering threads of blood-red flame. Then that's groove caught. I saw the curving charge of the flames. Across the sloping straw, a spurt of fire jetted from the window of my room. I knew at once what had happened. I remembered the crash I had heard when I'd rushed out to Montgomery's assistance. I'd overturned the lamp, the hopelessness of saving any of the contents of the enclosure stared me in the face. My mind came back to my plan of flight, and turning swiftly, I looked to see where the two boats lay upon the beach. They were gone to axes lay upon the sands beside me. Ships and sprinters were scattered broadcast, and the ashes of the bonfire were blackening and smoking out of the dawn. Montgomery had burnt the boats to revenge himself upon me and prevent our return to mankind. A sudden convulsion of rage shook me. I was almost moved to Battery's foolish head in, as he lay there helpless at my feet. Then suddenly his hand moved so feebly, so pitifully that my wrath vanished. He groaned and opened his eyes. For a minute, I knelt down beside him and raised his head. He opened his eyes again, staring silently at the dawn. And then they met mine. The lids fell. "Sorry," he said presently. With an effort, he seemed trying to think. "The last," he murmured, "last of this silly universe. What a mess." I listened. His head fell helplessly to one side. I thought some drink might revive him, but there was neither drink nor vessel in which to bring drink at hand. He seemed suddenly heavier. My heart went cold. I bent down to his face, put my hand through the rent in his blouse. He was dead, and even as he died, a line of white heat, the limb of the sun, rose eastward beyond the projection of the bay, splashing its radiance across the sky and turning the dark sea into a weltering tumulter. Dazzling light, it fell like a glory upon his death-shrunken face. I let his head fall gently upon the rough pillow I had made for him and stood up. Before me was the glittering desolation of the sea, the awful solitude upon which I'd already suffered so much. Behind me the island hushed under the dawn, its beast people silent and unseen. The enclosure with all its provisions and ammunition burnt noisily with sudden gusts of flame, a fitful crackling, and now and then a crash. The heavy smoke drove up the beach away from me, rolling low over the distant treetops towards the huts in the ravine beside me, with the charred vestiges of the boats and these 5 dead bodies. Then out of the bush came 3 beasts, people with hunched shoulders, protruding heads, misshapen hands, awkwardly held and inquisitive, unfriendly eyes, and advanced towards me with hesitating gestures. Chapter 20. Alone with the beast folk. I faced these people, facing my fate in them single-handed. Now literally single-handed, for I had a broken arm. In my pocket was a revolver with 2 empty chambers. Among the chips scattered about the beach laid the 2 axes that had been used to chop up the boat. The tide was creeping in behind me. There was nothing for it but courage. I looked squarely into the visages of the advancing monsters. They avoided my eyes and their quivering nostrils. Investigated the bodies that lay beyond me on the beach. I took half a dozen steps, picked up the blood-stained whip that laid beneath the body of the Volf man, and cracked it. They stopped and stared at me. "Salute," said I. "Bow down." They hesitated. One bent his knees. I repeated my command with my heart in my mouth, and advanced upon them. One knelt, then the other 2. I turned and walked towards the dead bodies, keeping my face towards the 3 kneeling beast men. Very much as an actor passing up the stage visages the audience. "They broke the law," said I, putting my foot on the sayer of the law. "They have been slain, even the sayer of the law, even the other with the whip. Great is the law. Come and see, none escape," said one of them, advancing and peering. "None escape," said I, "therefore hear and do as I command." They stood up, looking questioningly at one another. "Stand there," said I. I picked up the hatchet and swung them by their heads from the sling of my arm. Turned Montgomery over, picked up his revolver, still loaded, into chambers, and bending down to rummage, found half a dozen cartridges in his pocket. "Take him," said I, standing up again and pointing with the whip. "Take him and carry him out and cast him into the sea." They came forward, evidently still afraid of Montgomery, but still more afraid of my cracking red whiplash, and after some fumbling and hesitation, some whip cracking and shouting, they lifted him gingerly, carried him down to the beach. When splashing into the dazzling welter of the sea, on said I, and carry him far. They went in up their armpits and stood regarding me. "Let go," said I, and the body of Montgomery vanished with a splash. Something seemed to tighten across my chest. "Good," said I with a break in my voice, and they came back, hurrying and fearful, to the margin of the water, leaving long wakes of black in the silver. At the water's edge they stopped, turning and glaring into the sea, as though they presently expected Montgomery to rise there from an exact vengeance. Now these Jedi, pointing to the other bodies, they took care not to approach the place where they had thrown Montgomery into the water, but instead carried the 4 dead beast people slantingly along the beach, perhaps 100 yards, before they waded out and cast them away, as I watched them disposing of the mangled remains of Mling. I had a light footfall behind me, and turning quickly, saw the big hyena's whine perhaps a dozen yards away. His head was bent down, his luminous gaze were fixed upon me, his stumpy hands clenched and held close by his side. He stopped in this crouching attitude when I turned, his eyes a little averted. For a moment we stood eye to eye. I dropped the whip and snatched at the pistol in my pocket, for I meant to kill this brute, the most formidable of any left now upon the island. Are the first excuse. It may seem treacherous, but so I was resolved. I was far more afraid of him than of any other. Two of the beast folk his continued life was, I knew, a threat against mine. I was perhaps a dozen seconds collecting myself, then cried, I salute, bow down. His teeth flashed upon me in a snow. Who are you that I should? Perhaps a little too spasmodically, I drew my revolver, aimed quickly and fired. I heard him yelp, saw him run sideways and turn. Knew I had missed and clicked back the cock with my thumb for the next shot. But he was already running headlong, jumping from side to side, and I dared not risk another miss every now and then. He looked back at me over his shoulder. He went slanting along the beach and vanished beneath the driving masses of dense smoke that was still pouring out from the burning enclosure. For some time I stood staring after him. I turned to my three obedient beast folk again and signaled them to drop the body they still carried. Then I went back to the place by the fire where the bodies had fallen and kicked the sand until all the brown blood stains were absorbed and hidden. I dismissed my three serfs with the wave of the hand and went up the beach into the thicket. I carried my pistol in my hand, my whip thrust with the hatchets in the sling of my arm. I was anxious to be alone, to think out the position in which I was now placed. A dreadful thing that I was only beginning to realize was that over all this island there was now no safe place where I could be alone and secure to rest or sleep. I had recovered strength amazingly since my landing, but I was still inclined to be nervous and to break down under any great stress. I felt that I ought to cross the island and establish myself with the beast people and make myself secure in their confidence, but my heart failed me. I went back to the beach and, turning eastward, past the burning enclosure, made for a point where a shallow spit of coral sand ran out towards the reef. Here I could sit down and think, my back to the sea and my face against any surprise. And there I sat, chin on knees, the sun beating down upon my head, and unspeakable dread in my mind, plotting how I could live on against the hour of my rescue, if ever rescue came. I tried to review the whole situation as calmly as I could, but it was difficult to clear the thing of emotion. I began turning over in my mind the reason of Montgomery's despair. They will change, he said. They're sure to change. And Morale, what was it that Morale had said? The stubborn beast flesh grows day by day, back again. Then I came round to the hyena's whine. I felt sure that if I did not kill that brute, he would kill me. The sayer of the law was dead. Worst luck. They knew now that we of the whips could be killed. Even as they themselves were killed, were they peering at me already, out of the green masses of ferns and palms over yonder, watching until I came within their spring. Were they plotting against me? What was the hyena's whine telling them? My imagination was running away with me into a morass of unsubstantial fears. My thoughts were disturbed by a crying of seabirds, hurrying towards some black object that had been stranded by the waves. On a beach near the enclosure, I knew what that object was, but I had not the heart to go back and drive them off. I began walking along the beach in the opposite direction, designing to come round the eastward corner of the island and so approach the ravine of the huts without traversing the possible ambuscades of the thickets. Perhaps half a mile along the beach, I became aware of one of my three beast folk advancing out of the landward bush towards me. I was now so nervous with my own imaginings that I immediately drew my revolver. Even the propitiatory gestures of the creature failed to disarm me. He hesitated as he approached. "Go away," cried I. There was something very suggestive of a dog in the cringing attitude of the creature. It retreated a little way, very like a dog being sent home, then stopped looking at me imploringly with canine brown eyes. "Go away," said I. "Do not come near me." "May I not come near you?" It said. "No." "Go away," I insisted, and snapped my whip. Then, putting my whip in my teeth, I stooped for a stone, and with that threat, drove the creature away. So in solitude, I came round by the ravine of the beast people, and hiding among the weeds and reeds that separated this crevice from the sea, I watched such of them as appeared, trying to judge from their gestures and appearance how the death of Morrow Montgomery and the destruction of the House of Pain had affected them. I know now the folly of my cowardice. Had I kept my courage up to the level of the dawn, had I not allowed it to ever weigh in solitary thought, I might have drafted the vacant sector of Morrow and ruled over the beast people. As it was, I lost the opportunity and sank to the position of a mere leader among my fellows. Towards noon, certain often came and squatted, basking in the hot sand. The imperious voices of hunger and thirst prevailed. Over my dread, I came out of the bushes and, revolver in hand, walked down towards these seated figures. One, a Wolf woman, turned her head and stared at me, and then the others. None attempted to rise or salute me. I felt too faint and weary to insist, and I let the moment pass. "I want food," said I almost apologetically. And drawing near, "There is food in the hearts," said an ox-bomb, and drowsily, and looking away from me, I passed them and went down into the shadow and odors of the almost deserted ravine. In an empty hut, I feasted on some specked and half-decayed fruit, and then, after I had propped some branches and sticks about the opening and placed myself with my face towards it, my hand upon my revolver, the exhaustion of the last 30 hours claimed its own, and I fell into a light slumber, hoping that the flimsy barricade I directed would cause sufficient noise in its removal to save me from surprise. Chapter 21: The Reversion of the Beast Folk. In this way I became one among the beast people, in the island of Dr. Moreau. When I awoke, it was dark about me. My arm ached in its bandages. I sat up, wondering at first where I might be. I heard coarse voices talking outside. Then I saw that my barricade had gone, and that the opening of the hut stood clear. My revolver was still in my hand. I heard something breathing, saw something crouched together close beside me. I held my breath, trying to see what it was. It began to move slowly, interminably. Then something soft and warm and moist passed across my hand. All my muscles contracted. I snatched my hand away. A cry, alarm, began and was stifled in my throat. Then I just realized what had happened, sufficiently to stay my fingers on the revolver. "Who is that?" I said in a hoarse whisper. The revolver still pointed. "Hi, master. Who are you?" "They say there is no master now, but I know. I carried the bodies into the sea, or walker in the sea, the bodies of those you slew. I am your slave, master. Are you the one I met on the beach?" I asked the same, master. The thing was evidently faithful enough, for it might have fallen upon me as I slept. "It is well," I said, extending my hand for another licking kiss. I began to realize what its presence meant, and the tide of my courage flowed. "Where are the others?" I asked. "They are mad, they are fools. To the dog man even now they talk together. Beyond there they say, 'The master is dead, the other with the whip is dead. That other who walked in the sea is as we are. We have no master, no whips, no house of pain anymore. There is an end. We love the law and will keep it, but there is no pain, no master. No whips forever again, so they say, but I know, master, I know." I felt in the darkness and patted the dog man's head. "It is well," I said again. "Presently you will slay them all," said the dog man. "Presently," I answered, "I will slay them all. After certain days and certain Things have come to pass, every one of them save those you spare. Every one of them shall be slain. What the master wishes to kill, the master kills. To the dog man with a certain satisfaction in his voice. And that their sins may grow, I said. Let them live in their folly until their time is ripe. Let them not know that I am the master. The master's will is sweet, said the dog man, with the ready tact of his canine blood. But one has sinned, said, him I will kill whenever I may meet him. When I say to you that is he, see that you fall upon him. And now I will go to the men and women who are assembled together. For a moment the opening of the hut was blackened by the exit of the dog man. Then I followed and stood up, almost in the exact spot where I had been, when I had heard Monroe and his staghound pursuing me, but now it was night, and all the miasmatic ravine about me was black. And beyond, instead of a green summit slope, I saw a red fire, before which hunched protest figures moved to and row. Farther with the thick trees, a bank of darkness, fringed above with a black lace of the upper branches. The moon was just riding up on the edge of the ravine, and like a bar across its face, drove the spire of vapor that was forever streaming from the funerals of the island. Walk by me, said I, nerving myself, and side by side we walked down the narrow way, taking little heed of the dim things that appeared at us out of the huts. None about the fire attempted to salute me. Most of them disregarded me ostentatiously. I looked round for the hyena's wine, but he was not there altogether. Perhaps 20 of the beast folk squatted, staring into the fire or talking to one another. He is dead, he is dead, the master is dead. To the voice of the 8 men to the right of me, the house of pain, there is no house of pain. He is not dead to die, in a loud voice. Even now he watches us. This startled then 20 pairs of eyes regarding me. The house of pain is gone today. It will come again, the master you cannot see. Yet even now he listens among you, true to the dog man. There was staggered at my assurance. An animal may be ferocious and cunning enough, but it takes a real man to tell a lie. The man of the bandaged arm speaks. A strange thing, said one of the beast folk. I tell you it is so, I said. The master and the house of pain will come again. Woe be to him who breaks the law. They looked curiously at one another. With an affectation of indifference, I began to chop idly at the ground in front of me with my hatchet. They looked, I noticed, at the deep cuts I made in the turf. Then the satyr raised a doubt. I answered him. Then one of the dappled things objected, and an animated discussion sprang up around the fire. Every moment, I began to feel more convinced of my present security. I talked now without the catching in my breath, due to the intensity of my excitement. That had troubled me at first. In the course of about an hour, I had really convinced several of the bees folk of the truth of my assertions, and talked most of the others into a dubious state. I kept a sharp eye for my enemy, the hyena's wine, but he never appeared. Every now and then, a suspicious movement would startle me, but my confidence grew rapidly. Then as the moon crept down from the zenith, one by one the listeners began to yawn, showing the oddest teeth in the light of the sinking fire. And first one, and then another, retired towards the dens in the ravine, and I, dreading the silence and darkness, went with them, knowing I was safer with several of them than with one alone. In this manner began the longer part of my sojourn upon this island of Dr. Moreau. But from that night until the end came, there was but one thing happened to tell, save a series with numerable small, unpleasant details, and the fretting of an incessant uneasiness, so that I prefer to make no chronicle, for that gap of time, to tell only one cardinal incident of the 10 months I spent as an intimate of these half-humanized brutes. There is much that sticks in my memory that I could write, things that I would cheerfully give my right hand to forget, but they do not help the telling of the story. In the retrospect, it is strange to remember how soon I fell in with these monsters' ways and gained my confidence again. I have my quarrels with them, of course, and could show some of their teeth marks still. But they soon gained a wholesome respect for my trick of throwing stones, and for the bite of my hatchet and my Saint Bernard. Man's loyalty was of infinite service to me. I found their simple scale of honor was based mainly on the capacity for inflicting trenchant wounds. Indeed, I may say without vanity, I hope that I held something like preeminence among them, one or two whom, in a rare access of high spirits, I had scarred rather badly, bore me a grudge, but it vented itself chiefly behind my back and at a safe distance from my missiles and grimaces, the hyenas. Wine avoided me, and I was always on the alert for him. My inseparable dog man hated and dreaded him intensely. I really believe that was at the root of the brute's attachment to me. It was soon evident to me that the former monster had tasted blood and gone the way of the leopard man. He formed a lair somewhere in the forest and became solitary. Once I tried to induce the beast folk to hunt him, but I lacked the authority to make them cooperate. For one end, again and again, I tried to approach his den and come upon him unaware, but always he was too acute for me and saw or winded me and got away. He'd made every forest pathway dangerous to me, and my ally with his lurking ambuscades. The dog man scarcely dared to leave my side. In the first month or so, the beast folk, compared with their latter condition, were human enough. Ever one or two beside my canine friend, I even conceived a friendly tolerance. Little pink sloth creature displayed an odd affection for me, and talked to following me about. The monkey man bored me, however. He assumed on the strength of his 5 digits that he was my equal, was forever jabbering at me, jabbering the most errant nonsense. One thing about him entertained me a little. He had a fantastic trick of coining new words. He had an idea, I believe, that to gabble about names that meant nothing was a proper use of speech. He called it big things, to distinguish it from little things, the same everyday interests of life. If ever I made a remark he did not understand, he would praise it very much, ask me to say it again, learn it by heart, and go off repeating it with a word wrong. Here or there to all the milder of the beast people, he thought nothing of what was plain and comprehensible. I invented some very curious, big things for his special use, I think. Now that he was the silliest creature I ever met, he had developed in the most wonderful way the distinctive silliness of man without losing one jot of the natural folly of a monkey. This, I say, was in the earlier weeks of my solitude among these brutes. During that time, they respected the usage established by the law, behaved with general decorum. Once, I found another rabbit torn to pieces by the hyenas, while I'm insured, but that was all. It was about May when I first distinctly perceived a growing difference in their speech and carriage, a growing coarseness of articulation, a growing disinclination to talk. My monkey man's jabba multiplied in volume, but grew less and less comprehensible. More and more simian, some of the others seemed altogether slipping their hold upon speech, but they still understood what I said to them at that time. Can you imagine language once clear-cutting, exact, softening and guttering, losing shape and import, becoming mere lumps of sound again, and they walked erect with an increasing difficulty, though they evidently felt ashamed of themselves. Every now and then I would come upon one or another, running on toes and fingertips, quite unable to recover the vertical attitude. They held things more clumsily, drinking by suction, feeding by knowing grew commoner every day. I realized more keenly than ever what Morrow had told me about the stubborn beast flesh. They were reverting, and reverting very rapidly, some of them the pioneers in this. I noticed with some surprise, for all females began to disregard the injunction of decency. Deliberately for the most part, others even attempted public outrages upon the institution of monogamy. The tradition of the law was clearly losing its force. I cannot pursue this disagreeable subject. My dog man imperceptibly slipped back to the dog again. Day by day he became dumb, quadrupedal Harry. I scarcely noticed the transition from the companion on my right hand to the lurching dog at my side. As the carelessness and disorganization increased, from day to day, the lane of dwelling places at no time very sweet became so loathsome that I left it, and going across the island, made myself a hovel of boughs, and made the black ruins of Morrow's enclosure. Some memory of pain I found still made that place the safest from the beast folk. It would be impossible to detail every step of the lapsing of these monsters, to tell how day by day the human semblance left them, how they gave up bandagings and wrappings, abandoned at last every stitch of clothing, how the hair began to spread over the exposed limbs, how their foreheads fell away and their visages projected, how the crazy, human intimacy I'd permitted myself with some of them, in the first month of my loneliness, became a shuddering horror to recall. The change was slow and inevitable for them and for me. It came without any definite shock. I still went among them in safety, because no jolt in the downward glide had released the increasing charge of explosive animalism that ousted the human day by day. But I began to fear that soon now. That shock must come by St. Bernard. Brute followed me to the enclosure every night, and his vigilance enabled me to sleep, at times in something like peace. The little pink sloth thing became shy and left me to crawl back to its natural life. Once more among the tree branches, we were in just the state of equilibrium that would remain in one of those happy family cages which animal tamers exhibit, if the tamer was to leave it forever, of course. These creatures did not decline into such beasts as the reader has seen zoological gardens, into ordinary bears, wolves, tigers, oxen, swine, and apes. There was still something strange about each. In each Morrow had blended this animal with that. One perhaps was ursine chiefly, another feline chiefly, another bovine chiefly. But each was tainted with other creatures, the kind of generalized animalism appearing through the specific dispositions, and the dwindling shreds of the humanity still startled me every now and then, a momentary recrudescence of speech, perhaps an unexpected dexterity of the forefoot, a pitiful attempt to walk erect. I too must have undergone strange changes. My clothes hung about me as yellow rags, through whose rents showed the tan skin. My hair grew long and became matted together. I'm told that even now, my eyes have a strange brightness, a swift alertness of movement. At first, I spent the daylight hours on the Southwood beach, watching for a ship, hoping and praying for a ship. I counted on the Apocacwana, returning as the year wore on. But you never came. 5 times I saw sails and thrice smoke, but nothing ever touched the island. I always had a bonfire ready, but no doubt the volcanic reputation of the island was taken. To account for that, it was only about September or October that I began to think of making a raft. By that time my arm had healed, and both my hands were at my service again. At first I found my helplessness appalling. I had never done any carpentry or such like work in my life, and I spent day after day in experimental chopping and binding among the trees. I had no ropes and could hit on nothing wherewith to make ropes. None of the abundant creepers seemed limber or strong enough, and with all my litter of scientific education, I could not devise any way of making them. So I spent more than a fortnight grubbing among the black ruins of the enclosure and on the beach where the boats have been burned, looking for nails and other stray pieces of metal that might prove of service. Now and then some beast creature would watch me and go leaping off when I called to it. There came a season of thunderstorms and heavy rain, which greatly retarded my work. But at last the raft was completed. I was delighted with it, but with a certain lack of practical sense, which has always been my bane. I had made it a mile or more from the sea. Before I dragged it down to the beach, the thing could fall into pieces. Perhaps it is as well that I was saved from launching it. But at the time, my misery, my failure was so acute that for Some days, I simply moped on the beach and stared at the water. Thought of death, I did not, however, mean to die. And an incident occurred that warned me unmistakably of the folly of letting the days pass so, for each fresh day was fraught with increasing danger from the beast. People, I was lying in the shade of the enclosure wall, staring out to sea when I was startled by something cold, touching the skin of my heel and starting round. Found the little pink sloth creature blinking into my face. He had long since lost speech and active movement, and the lang hair of the little brute grew thicker every day and his stumpy claws more askew. He made a moaning noise when he saw he had attracted my attention, went a little way towards the bush and looked back at me. At first I did not understand, but presently it occurred to me that he wished me to follow him, and this I did at last slowly, for the day was hot. When we reached the trees he clambered into them, but he could travel better among the swinging creepers than on the ground, and suddenly, in a trampled space, I came upon a ghastly group. My St. Bernard creature lay on the ground dead, and near his body crouched the hyena's whine, gripping the quivering flesh with its misshapen claws. Gnawing at it and snarling with delight, as I approached, the monster lifted its glaring eyes to mine. Its lips went trembling back from its red-stained teeth, and it growled menacingly. It was not afraid and not ashamed. The last vestige of the human taint had vanished. I advanced. A stepfather stopped and pulled out my revolver. At last I had him face to face. The brute made no sign of retreat, but its ears went back. Its hair bristled and its body crouched together. I aimed between the eyes and fired. As I did so, the thing rose straight at me in a leap, and I was knocked over like a 9-pin. It clutched at me with its crippled hand and struck me in the face. Its spring carried it over me. I fell under the hind part of its body, but luckily I had hit as I meant, and it had died. Even as it leapt, I crawled out from under its unclean weight and stood up trembling, staring at its quivering body. That danger at least was over, but this I knew was only the first of the series of relapses that must come. I burnt both of the bodies on a pyre of brushwood, but after that I saw that unless I left the island, my death was only a question of time. The beast people by that time had, with one or two exceptions, left the ravine and made themselves lairs, according to their taste, among the thickets of the island. Few prowled by day, most of them slept. The island might have seemed desert to a newcomer, but at night, the air was hideous with their calls and howling. I had half a mind to make a massacre of them, to build traps or fight them with my knife, and I possessed sufficient cartridges. I should not have hesitated to begin the killing. There can now be scarcely a score left of the dangerous carnivores. The bravery of these were already dead after the death of this poor dog of mine. My last friend I too adopted to some extent the practice of slumbering in the daytime in order to be on my guard at night. I rebuilt my den in the walls of the enclosure with such a narrow opening that anything attempting to enter must necessarily make a considerable noise. The creatures had lost the art of fire too, and recovered their fear of it. I turned once more, almost passionately now, to hammering together stakes and branches to form a raft for my escape. I found 1,000 difficulties. I am an extremely unhandy man. My schooling was over before the days of Floyd, but most of the requirements were after. I met at last in some clumsy circuitous way or other, and this time I took care of the strength. The only insurmountable obstacle was that I had no vessel to contain the water I should need. If I floated forth upon these untraveled seas, I would have even tried pottery, but the island contained no clay. I used to go moping about the island, trying with all my might to solve this one last difficulty. Sometimes I would give way to wild outbursts of rage and hack and splinter some unlucky tree in my intolerable vexation. But I could think of nothing, and then came a day, a wonderful day which I spent in ecstasy. I saw a sail to the southwest. A small sail I got of a little schooner, and forthwith I lit a great pile of brushwood and stood by it, in the heat of it and the heat of the midday sun, watching. All day I watched that sail, eating or drinking nothing, so that my head reeled, and the beasts came and glared at me, and seemed to wonder and went away. It was still distant when night came and swallowed it up, and all night I toiled to keep my blaze bright and high. The eyes of the beast shone out of the darkness, marveling in the dorm. The sail was nearer, and I saw that the dirty lug sail of a small boat, but it sailed strangely. My eyes were weary with watching, and I appeared and couldn't believe them. Two men were in the boat, sitting low down, one by the bows, the other at the rudder. The head was not kept to the wind. It yawned and fell away as the day grew brighter. I began waving the last rag of my jacket to them, but they did not notice me and sat still, facing each other. I went to the lowest point of the low headland and gesticulated and shouted. There was no response. The boat kept on her aimless course, making slowly, very slowly, for the bay. Suddenly a great white bird flew up out of the boat, and neither of the men stirred nor noticed it. It circled round and then came sweeping overhead with its strong wings outspread. Then I stopped shouting and sat down on the headland and rested my chin on my hands and stared. Slowly, slowly, the boat drove past towards the west. I would have swam out to it, but something, a cold, vague fear, kept me back. In the afternoon the tide stranded the boat and left it 100 yards or so to the westward of the ruins of the enclosure. The men in it were dead, had been dead so long that they fell to pieces. When I tilted the boat on its side and dragged them out, one had a shock of red hair like the captain of the Apocakwana, and a dirty white cap lay in the bottom of the boat. As I stood beside the boat, 3 of the beasts came slinking out of the bushes and sniffing towards me. One of my spasms of disgust came upon me. I thrust a little boat down the beach and clambered on board her. 2 of the brutes were wolf beasts and came forward with quivering nostrils and glittering eyes. The third was a horrible nondescriptive bear and bull. When I saw them approaching, those wretched remains, heard them snarling at one another, and caught the gleam of their teeth, a frantic horror succeeded my repulsion. I turned my back upon them, struck the log, and began paddling out to sea. I could not bring myself to look behind me. I lay, however, between the reef and the island. That night and the next morning, went round to the stream and filled the empty keg aboard with water. Then, with such patience as I could command, I collected a quantity of fruit and waylaid and killed 2 rabbits with my last 3 cartridges. While I was doing this, I left the boat, mauled to an inward projection of the reef, for fear of the beast people. Chapter 20. To the man alone. In the evening I started and drove out to sea, before a gentle wind from the southwest, slowly, steadily, and the island grew smaller and smaller, and the lank spire of smoke dwindled to a finer line against the hot sunset. The ocean rose up around me, hiding that low dark patch from my eyes. The daylight, the trailing glory of the sun, when streaming out of the sky, was drawn aside like some luminous curtain. At last I looked into the blue gulf of humanity, which the sunshine hides, and saw the floating hosts of the stars. The sea was silent, the sky was silent. I was alone with the night and silence. So I drifted for 3 days, eating and drinking sparingly, and meditating upon all that had happened to me, not desiring very greatly then to see men again. One unclean rag was about me, my hair a black tangle. No doubt my discoverers thought me a madman. It is strange, but I felt no desire to return to mankind. I was only glad to be quit of the foulness of the beast, people, and on the 3rd day, I was picked up by a brig from a pier to San Francisco. Neither the captain nor the mate would believe my story, judging that solitude and danger had made me mad, and fearing their opinion might be that of others. I refrained from telling my adventure further, and professed to recall nothing that had happened to me. Between the loss of the Lady Vane and the time when I was picked up again, the space of gear, I had to act with the utmost circumspection to save myself from the suspicion of insanity. My memory of the law of the two dead sailors, of the ambuscades of the darkness, of the body and the cane brake haunted me, and unnatural as it seems, with my return to mankind came, instead of that confidence and sympathy I had expected, a strange enhancement of the uncertainty and dread I had experienced. During my stay upon the island, no one will believe me. I was almost as clear to men as I had been to the beast. People I may have caught something of the natural wildness of my companions. They say that terror is a disease, and anyhow, I can witness that for several years now. A restless fear has dwelt in my mind, such a restless fear as a half-tamed lion cub may feel. My trouble took the strangest form. I could not persuade myself that the men and women I met were not also another beast people, animals, half brought into the outward image of human souls, and that they would presently begin to revert to show. First this bestial mark, and then that. But I have confided my case to a strangely able man, a man who had known Morrow, and seemed half to credit my story, a mental specialist, and he has helped me mightily. Though I do not expect that the terror of that island will ever altogether leave me, at most times it lies far in the back of my mind, a mere distant cloud of memory and a faint distrust. But there are times when the little cloud spreads until it obscures the whole sky. Then I look about being my fellow men and I go in fear. I see visages keen and bright, others dull or dangerous, others unsteady, insincere, none that have the calm authority of a reasonable soul. I feel as though the animal was surging up through them. Presently the degradation of the islanders will be played over again on a larger scale. I know this is an illusion, that these seeming men and women about me are indeed men and women forever perfectly reasonable creatures, full of human desires and tender solicitude, emancipated from instinct and the slaves of no fantastic law, beings altogether different from the beast folk. Yet I shrink from them, from their curious glances, their inquiries and assistance, and long to be away from them and alone. For that reason I live near the broad, free downland and can escape the other, when the shadow is over my soul, and very sweet is the empty downland, than under the wind-swept sky when I lived in London. The horror was well nigh insupportable. I could not get away from men. Their voices came through windows. Locked doors were flimsy safeguards. I would go out of the streets to fight with my delusion, and prowling women would mew after me. Furtive craving, men glanced jealously at me. Weary pale workers go coughing by me with tired eyes and eager paces like wounded deer dripping blood. Old people bent and dull pass murmuring to themselves, and all unheeding a ragged tale of gibing children. Then I would turn aside into some chapel, and even there such was my dishedrops. It seemed that the preacher gibbered big thinks, even as the ape-man had done, or into some library, and there the intent visages over the books seemed but patient creatures waiting for prey, particularly nauseous with the blank, expressionless visages of people in trains and omnibuses. They seem no more my fellow creatures than dead bodies will be, so that I did not dare to travel unless I was assured of being alone, and even it seemed that I too was not a reasonable creature, but only an animal, tormented with some strange disorder in its brain, which sent it to wander alone, like a sheep stricken with GID. This is a mood, however, that comes to me now, I thank God, more rarely. I have withdrawn myself from the confusion of cities and multitudes, and spend my days surrounded by wise books, bright windows in this life of ours, lit by the shining souls of men. I see few strangers and have but a small household. My days I devote to reading and to experiments in chemistry, and I spend many of the clear nights in the study of astronomy. There is, though I do not know how there is, or why there is a sense of infinite peace and protection in the glittering hosts of heaven. There it must be, I think, in the vast and eternal laws of matter, and not in the daily cares and sins and troubles of men, that whatever is more than animal within us must find its solace and its hope. I hope, or I could not live. And so in hope and solitude, my story ends.